Okay, so welcome everybody to session 5 of 6 of this year's Responsible Raw Materials Conference. And during this conference, we've been discussing the theme of creating certainty in a world of change. And the theme has sparked lots of debate. And in fact, in the previous session, please do feel free to go back and listen to it. Some of the speakers basically ripped the title of the conference apart because they said, this is not about certainty, Sarah. That is a very silly idea. In fact, this is about uncertainty. Semantics, maybe, but actually they had some really, really good points. So we've been listening and engaging with speakers from all over the world, and it's been absolutely fantastic. Over the last few days, we have heard from people in Indonesia, the Philippines, different parts of Australia, South Africa, different African countries, all across Europe, the UK, including Ireland, of course, as well. And then into a number of Latin American countries and through into North America too. So it's been absolutely brilliant. And people have been dialing in as well from all over the world. So we've had people from India to Cameroon to you name it. We've had people with all kinds of backgrounds, geographies, and also disciplines. So whilst, as per usual at this conference, we do have one or two geoscientists because you know what? That's where some of us come from, isn't it, Aileen? I think we might identify with some of those rocks. But of course, we understand that in the world of raw materials, amazingly, it's not just about the rocks. Actually, there's a whole load of other stuff that's really important as well. So we've had people who are experts in social science and law and history. We've had the UK ambassador to Chile. We've had people from all kinds of walks of life, people who are experts in finance. If you want to go to a talk that has probably one of the best titles we've ever come across, Nigel Hart gave us a talk a couple of days ago about who wants to be a mineral heir, which being a geologist, I think that's hilarious. But you see, the bar is low when you're speaking to a geoscientist. So we've had talks from all kinds of different individuals across the world. Some of those talks have disagreed with one another, which is brilliant because that's where we find different ways of thinking, different modes of thought. My mind is still trying to process one of the talks we had this morning from Rini in Australia, where she described different types of value. So when you're trying to place a value on a project, of course, a lot of people, or the normal way of doing it is to talk about it in terms of money or different ways of measuring it that way. But of course, different people from different places will place more value on a sense of place or history or different aspects of value itself. And there are lots of different frameworks to think about this. But I think especially if you are trained in a certain way of thinking, actually having that door open to how somebody else thinks is really useful because it helps you increase that empathy. And then one of the talks that is still very much sitting, noodling away in the back of my mind is Isabel's talk that she gave in our first session. Isabel is from M&C Saatchi, and she just basically said, right, we're all being overloaded with information at the moment, but let me explain to you what is really going on. So if you want to understand what is really going on in the world right now, go and listen to Isabel's talk because it's truly terrifying. She does talk about the death of truth and stuff like that, which is a little bit depressing. So you need to make sure you have a happy and uplifting talk that comes after it, because otherwise you might just curl up and cry. But it gave, I think, certainly me a fantastic framework through which I could actually process and understand a bit more about what might be going on in the world round about me. A massive thank you to the lovely Miranda and Aileen, who without them, this conference wouldn't be happening. And we have the fantastic Helen and Joss and the rest of the team behind the scenes as well. But Aileen, you have been pulling an absolute blinder. So thank you very much for making this happen. Brilliant. And Miranda, thank you as always for everything, but especially bringing your dogs into these conversations because they are stars. You say they're smelly, but they are stars. We love them dearly. So in terms of what has been happening really, if you haven't found the website yet, the website can be found at www www.responsiblerawmaterials.com. I didn't really need to say the www, did I? I think we all know that by now in the real world. But this is the website. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because if you go to the 2026 conference page, you can either obviously watch live on YouTube. Hello to those of you who are out there at the moment. But if you scroll all the way down to the bottom of the page, this is where you can see the agenda that we have been working through over the last few days. And now it is, last time I checked, it is Thursday, the 30th of April, and we're in session 5, so running from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. British summer time. And what's really exciting about the way this is set up is that if you go and check out somebody's name, so for example, Sarah, and you click on Learn More, this will take you to Sarah's biography. So you can see everything coming together there on a little page. So if you're wondering who on earth is this amazing Sarah Shee, well, you can find out by clicking on her name. Now, if I just go back to this page, I'm going to go back in time. Let's go to yesterday's session. And so, for example, Julia Sutcliffe, so she is the Chief Scientific Advisor for minerals and metals here in the UK. If I click on her page, you will get her biography. And also, because the team is so quick off the mark, you will get her video of her talk as well. So if we note something as we're going through today's session, etc., do feel free to go back and take a look at this. And I'm going to go rogue now. I'm going to check out this morning's talks. So Fiona Clowder, who only spoke a few hours ago, let's see. Check it out, team. The video is already up there. That's how quick we are. So just to make this clear, we do birthdays, weddings, etc. We are available for hire. No, in all seriousness, Responsible Raw Materials, it's a voluntary organisation. We do this for free. We've been doing it all the way since 2020. So if you want to go back and see how much younger we looked a number of years ago, go back to the 2020 conference where you can see we heard from lots and lots of people. Of course, there wasn't much else to do at this point in time. There was that thing called COVID. I don't know, there was a certain lockdown this time back in 2020. But if we go back there and we can click on these talks, so Nadia Kunz, who is an expert with regards to all things water, and there's going to be some more watery chat later on today, you can go back in time and you can explore all of the different conferences that we have run over the last few years. Other things that are here on the website, which I'm sure you won't need to dive into now because this afternoon's presentations are going to be so exciting. But just in case you get bored, you won't. But just in case you get bored, you can go to our resources and learning hub. And this is where we've got access to or links to all kinds of different areas, different teaching materials, different reports that we found on the internet, etc. And also, this is quite an exciting resource. Last summer, some of our team, they put together a collation of all of the different learning and teaching initiatives that have been put together, and we found 173. So if you're wanting to work out how to teach someone about raw materials or something like that, other people have been thinking about this as well. So go and check out these resources. They are all free to access, and all we've done is just try and pull them together into a single area. Now, if we are missing something, or if you've written a fantastic report and you'd like us to share it through the website, just let us know and we will very happily put it up there in lights for all to see. So coming back to the conference here today, I'm so excited at the lineup that we have this afternoon. So just again, leaving that with you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can see them in all their glory. This afternoon, we're going to be hearing from a fantastic array of individuals. So the last person we'll hear from is the amazing Tesney Morgan. Now, Tesney and I met through the world of women in mining in the UK, but more specifically, Tesney kind of really revolutionised how this was done at the University of St Andrews, but now works in the world of exploration. And we're going to hear your talk, I think, is entitled All Bark, No Bite, Aligning Discussion on Next Generation Talent with Students and Early Career Support and Outreach. So I think that's brilliant, Tesney. So tell us what we actually need to be doing, which will be awesome. We're also joined by Kevin D'Souza, who is an amazing sustainability leader. So he started out life getting various degrees, etc., from the Royal School of Mines at Imperial College London. But now he works all over the world, and he's going to be sharing some of his thoughts on the coexistence with artisanal mining, from conflict to coexistence, operational lessons from the ASM interface. So that's going to be really interesting. We've also got Heather and Laurie here with us as well, who are going to be talking about closing the gap, advancing eco-efficient mining in an era of constraint. And I know there's certainly a watery theme, having had a sneak peek of your slides earlier on, so that will be brilliant. Thank you so much for coming and joining us here today. We've got Gavin, who's joining us from the British Geological Survey. So he's the guy who's behind the UK Critical Minerals list. And I can see he's just joined us here. So if you think something should or should not be on that critical minerals list, he's your man to take it up with. But actually, more than that, Gavin's going to be given, where did Kevin come from? You're not Kevin, you're Gavin. Gavin's also going to be giving us an insight into some of the more sort of foresighting and those aspects with regards to our understanding of critical minerals. And of course, this looks different if you're looking at it through the eyes of the UK perspective, the US, different countries around the world, because our demands are all different. We've got Melody McNeil, who's dialing into us from PAX, and I'm really excited to hear what you've got to say. I've met some of your colleagues at a big conference in Toronto a few months ago, and really excited to hear perspectives with regards to creating certainty above ground. So from a geological perspective, people always think about below the ground, but actually 80% of projects fail due to the stuff up on the surface, and especially when this involves people, because people are complicated and often change their minds, or you think you understand what's going on and no, you don't. Is that fair, Melody? Yeah, excellent. So absolutely delighted to be hearing that. Yeah, is there anything you want to come in and say there, Melody?
No, I was just going to say people are the wild card.
People are the wild card. There we go. There we go. There's the soundbite for today's session already. People are the wild card. We're talking about wild cards. We've got Burak. Did you like that segue, Burak? I think that fits actually. And Burak and I, we've been able to work together, I guess, probably for about the last year or so, a little bit more or less. And Burak does do work within the raw materials space, but is speaking to us more about real estate and infrastructure, and especially those areas where being able to understand various different uncertainties, that's really, really important in this space. But to kick us off, we're going to start with the amazing, the one and only Sarah Shi. So Sarah, if you want to start sharing your slides, now is a good moment. Sarah, I suspect, is dialing into us from California, although she does every so often, she hops across to the other coast of America, which really confuses me when we're dialing into things together. Sarah and I, we are actually on the organizing committee of another conference at the moment. It's called the Gordon Conference, which makes everybody laugh because it's got nothing to do with me. I just happen to have the same surname. But Sarah is truly amazing. And as you can see from the screen in front of us, we're going to kick off today's session with Sarah talking about something to do with rocks. So with that, Sarah, I will hand over to your wonderful self. Off you go. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction, Sarah. I'm one of those geoscientists that you were talking about. Today, I'm really going to focus in on how we can actually use machine learning to think about and quantify and communicate uncertainties. I think I've been able to dial in a few times to hear some perspectives on AI from the Oxford SEG students and from Sean Barker and others. And today I want to build in on that a little more. I'll show you how this plays out in a pretty fundamental step of ore characterization by simply identifying mineralogy. So I really liked what you were saying about certainty and uncertainty, right? Those are kind of different ways of framing some similar problems. And to understand why this step of like thinking about mineralogy is so consequential, I want to start off with a problem that Frenzel and colleagues laid out very clearly. Ore deposits, we know, are quite geologically complex. They're products of multiple events. We have thermal gradients, metamorphic overprinting, weathering. And what that means is that if we think about the mineralogy and texture across a deposit, there's pretty significant variation. Difficulty is that we can only ever sample a pretty small volume or a fraction of the volume through drill cores if we're lucky. And so we're always working with incomplete information. You can kind of visualize this with the maps that are shown on the right. Panel A shows the copper grade across a deposit, which is kind of our best estimate at things. But if we look at panels B and C, what we see is that these realizations of copper recovery look almost nothing like the grade map. And that's because recovery isn't necessarily controlled by grade. There are other factors going into it. And what I think Frenzel and colleagues point out is that more than half of new mining operations fail to reach their projected performance targets, which is a bit of a staggering statistic. And this is the principal reason of why. You have really strong variability, but it's not necessarily being characterized. And that really starts at the most basic level of thinking about the mineralogy. And these labels are what currently lack some strong uncertainty assessment. So everything kind of starts with the minerals. And accurate mineralogy really underpins every primary ore property. If you're trying to constrain and reconstruct a pressure temperature history path of a magmatic system or characterize an ore deposit for processing, both of these kind of start at the step where you need to know what minerals are present, what abundances, what are the grain sizes, what are the compositions, and what really is where I'm focusing in is that we want to kind of develop these open source tools for doing this classification rapidly at scale and with some sense of uncertainty and some quantification of uncertainty. So why does this problem kind of need some focus now? I would say that two things have really changed that have caused a data revolution. So instrumentation has gotten a lot faster. These modern EDS detectors or energy dispersive X-ray detectors can kind of map these entire thin sections overnight. You can throw four thin sections into an SEM and come out with millions of pixels of full oxide chemistry. At the same time, there are also these geochemical databases that have tens of millions of analyses that aggregate a ton of analytical work from labs around the world. And so for both of these are really exciting developments, but the data are now arriving more rapidly than we can actually classify and handle it. And so you can collect a million analyses overnight and be stuck manually checking all of these mineral assignments or using proprietary software that gives you a label with no indication of how confident it is. And so this is what leads me to the project that I've been working on for the past 2 years or so. I've been building this open source package called Mineral ML aimed at answering some of these fundamental questions. So what minerals are in a rock, at what abundances, and with what compositions. So this code package kind of handles both tabular and mapped data. For tabular data, you're working with a spreadsheet of oxide analyses, so you get back what you want back is a predicted mineral, a prediction score, and uncertainty on that score itself, along with these sorts of two-dimensional visualizations to think about how your analyses relate to the distribution of minerals it was trained on. For the map data instead, the pipeline generates these phase maps, modal proportions, and stoichiometric subclassifications. So if you're working with feldspars, you can take all of your feldspars and immediately plot the compositions on the ternary. I'll walk you through the architecture and show how we can actually use machine learning to get at these uncertainty and then show some validation results. I know this is a bit of maybe an unfamiliar sort of slide, but basically what we've done here is design this neural network. Neural networks are essentially really flexible mathematical functions that learn patterns from examples. So if you show it millions of analyses where you already know the label, so let's say this is an olivine, this is a plagioclase, this is a CPX, it learns to recognize the chemical fingerprint of each one. And once trained, you can essentially apply it to new analyses that it's never seen, and it tells you what mineral it looks like. First bit of this neural network is a classifier. So you feed in these sorts of oxide compositions. The network transforms them into a series of layers, and what we want back is ultimately a predicted mineral and score between 0 and 1. A high score close to 1 would mean that it's really confident, whereas a low score means, oh, I'm not actually exactly sure what mineral this is. And the key design choice that actually lets us get at uncertainties is this variational layer that's labeled in part B of this figure. The weights essentially of this neural network are parameterized as distributions rather than fixed values, which is what gives us meaningful uncertainty estimates on each prediction rather than just a point answer. I won't focus too much on this because it's not exactly relevant to uncertainty as much, and I don't have quite the time. But if you're interested in learning more, I'll give a bit of a shameless plug for this manuscript, which is currently in review. The preprint is on Earth Archive, and you can go check that out. But essentially, this design choice of parametrizing these as weights or as distributions rather than single fixed answers for each input mean that the network can learn a range of possible answers and sample from that range at the time of prediction. The spread of these predictions is essentially our uncertainty estimate. So if you have a confident prediction, in blue, you essentially might see that all of the samples agree. So all of the passes through the neural network return the same answer. Whereas if you have an uncertain prediction, you might have a lot of disagreement across different passes. And what's useful about this is that the uncertainty essentially tracks data quality automatically. We did a dwell time or acquisition time experiment here at Berkeley, where we essentially were collecting spectra at 1 millisecond versus 50 milliseconds. And what you can see is that in the beginning, there's a lot of checkerboarding, there's speckling in the predictions of the neural network that we actually have. And correspondingly, the prediction scores kind of have this really wide spread. Whereas when we start acquiring for more time, this map really cleans up. You can see that the prediction scores also tend more towards the yellow bit of things. It's closer to 1. So the neural network is more confident in this. This is essentially providing us, the neural network is telling us where we can trust it without additional measurements and where maybe we want to re-examine the outputs with these prediction scores. And so we can use this as a flag for determining what regions of a phase map might need a second look and which do not. And so I think that uncertainty signal I showed you is really just one piece of a larger picture. I want to be precise about the different types of uncertainty at play here because they all require some different responses. First branch is aleatoric uncertainty. So this is what's irreducible. Minerals exist on solid solution series, they're zoned, they're altered, and to some extent, there are compositions that sit between oxides that are genuinely ambiguous. So if you think about the clinopyroxene and amphibole, there's a lot of overlap in their concentrations, and no amount of better data will really resolve that. And so this is reflected essentially in that p-bar value that kind of tells us how confident the neural network is in that prediction. We also have epistemic uncertainty, so what the model genuinely does not know. If you run in a phase that wasn't in the training data through this classifier, it'll appear as an outlier in latent space and carry a really high sigma p-bar value. And that's what the model is saying. And I haven't seen this before, essentially. Treat this analysis carefully. That signal is usually absent from most considerations of this. And lastly, I think what this really comes down to is how these kind of uncertainties kind of propagate and combine. When we have these point estimate labels that we maybe are using less critically, that really influences downstream models and downstream decisions. So we kind of have to consider both of these sorts of uncertainty before moving forward. I'll show some pretty maps now. So these are some examples of testing that we've done on some intrusive rocks and extrusive rocks. But essentially what I'm showing here is that we've tried to basically validate this method on looking at these different types of rocks. And in this example, we're comparing both compositional data on the right from EDS to basically structural data from EBST. So these are some of the maps that we've generated, and what you'll notice is that Mineral ML is returning maps that basically look or within 2 to 3% uncertainty of what sort of information we get back from the structural crystallographic information provided by EBST. Lends a lot of confidence to this model. This is another pretty rock, but you can kind of see how these different methods provide different sorts of information. So EBST is looking at crystallography, and so non-crystalline phases like glass, which is indicated in yellow here, aren't identified. And that's kind of the value-added information provided by chemistry. So I'll just wrap things up now, but I'll give a little pitch for Mineral ML. It's entirely open source and reproducible with the data and code that are publicly available. I've developed Jupyter notebooks and abundant documentation for running this code, so you could go run it yourself today if you are so inclined. I'm really interested in testing things out with different modes of data. So far I've used SEM EDS data, but I anticipate that there might be some extensions to XRF and to other maybe methods that are more commonly used in core logging. And we have a collaboration underway to kind of test these things out. Lastly, I'm a second year PhD student. This has been a project that's been in development for a little bit, but I've started building this model aimed at igneous systems, but this is sort of the first iteration of the model. We have targets moving forward to develop this, expand this model to kind of metamorphic phase assemblages and more ore relevant phases. Specifically, I'm going to be working on sulfides in the next few months. And that's what I have planned moving forward into the summer and through the fall. So if anyone has samples of interest that they'd like to test or specific mineralogy that might be useful, please do reach out. And with that, I think I will stop sharing.
Brilliant. Sarah, thank you so, so much. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much for that. Now, just quickly, for people who aren't geoscientists, etc., on the call, some of you might have been going, wow, pretty pictures. Not sure what all of the words were referring to. Don't worry, not even all the geoscientists in the room would have come across all the words, because that was absolutely brilliant what you've been putting together there, Sarah. I guess if we take a step back and we say, I think there's often the assumption that a geoscientist, whatever, should be able to look at a mineral and go, right, I know exactly what that is. But that's not the case, is it?
That is absolutely not. Especially when you're a student, I think the traditional way of doing a lot of this is looking at thin sections, right? And it takes a lot of like domain knowledge and expertise to kind of get to a point where you can be confident about that. And even so, when you're working with wonky compositions and things that you might not see as frequently, it takes quite a bit of time to get to that point where you can actually identify these things. So we've really adapted this and used this also as a teaching tool. So for a lot of students who are using the SEM for the first time, you're kind of shooting these electron beams at different minerals that you see that are pretty, but you don't necessarily know exactly what it is before you analyze it. And so what we've observed is that a lot of the time it's difficult to kind of distinguish these minerals even when you have compositions. And this is really where this code package comes into the mix.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. I mean, so that's the case there where obviously an SEM is basically a super duper microscope and you can get that chemical composition, can't you, coming back. So you're like, aha, okay, it's got
Yeah.
that much iron or magnesium or whatever in it. I know what kind of mineral that's probably going to be. Now you said, does anybody have any rocks in your talk? Well, unfortunately for you, you've got Richard Harrington on the line here. Who I don't know might have the entire Natural History Museum here in London at his disposal. And if you haven't already seen it, and this is for everybody, last year we made a documentary about raw materials, and it was based in the Natural History Museum. And some of the shots of the mineral gallery there in the museum are truly phenomenal. I think they almost brought a tear to Richard's eye when we rewatched it again as part of the one of the lunchtime sessions yesterday. But Richard's asking Sarah. He first says, great talk. And how does your process deal with mineral polymorphs? Can we incorporate structural mineral data in some way?
That's a great question, Richard. Thank you. I will say that that's exactly what we kind of are targeting with the EBSD. So these maps were basically collected by a postdoc in our lab, Charlie Gordon, who is an expert in EBSD. And so EBSD provides that sort of structural information that you're mentioning. For these maps, we're basically collecting both of them at the same time with a 50 or with some dwell time that's specified by what the uncertainties are and how rapidly we can kind of get a diffraction pattern. So we are trying to combine exactly that to kind of aim at this polymorph question because we can't really deal with that with just chemical compositional information. They have exactly the same chemistry but different structures, and that's kind of what the EBSD information is attempting to add.
Brilliant. So I guess that's using like different modes of data collection to get
Yeah.
different information, isn't it, about the minerals, and then go, okay, right, so I've got this chemical data, I've got more structural data, so that's therefore giving me a more confidence in what it is that I'm actually looking at. Is that
That's
correct?
exactly right. And that's kind of how we aimed at validating this method to say these two methods agree. So we can be quite confident that the neural network is returning something sensible. So it's a big part of our validation step in all of this.
Yeah, no, I love this because I think, one of the, I mean, it's not a very funny joke. I mean, I find it mildly amusing. Within the world of geology and raw materials is you say, right, well, one rock, two geologists, three answers. Because as well, I think the engineers of the world always accuse geologists of being, well, it's an arts subject, which of course I'm sure will surprise many of the social scientists and the humanities people here on the call because they might not consider geology as being an art. But I think this is something where being able to accept the fact that we don't necessarily know what something is, but your tool is then bringing that robustness to the table where we've got that ability to use machine learning, etc., to say, well, no, I feel a bit more confident about what it is that I'm looking at. Now, Sarah, there are more questions coming in the chat. You've got Jay, who's given you his email address and said, yes, please, let's go play. Excellent. Also, I think there are other questions coming in, but my WhatsApp has just blown up with the entire team behind the scenes discussing what's their favorite mineral. So I don't know, team, if there are any questions in there, because all I can see is Aileen just writing pyrite about 1,000 times. And not just that, she's now discussing what particular type of pyrite that's in there. Aileen, do you want to say anything really quickly?
Um, no, sorry, you caught me off guard there. Yeah, I in a very different life would have done a PhD on geochemistry of sulfide deposits, particularly in Ireland, which are kind of like a transition between Mississippi Valley type and what people used to call SEDEX as well. So that's a very technical thing for anyone who's not aware of deposit types, but basically they're supposed in sedimentary rock. But one of the things that we were looking at was around pyrite and using it as a potential vector toward mineralization as well, using geochemical maps. And one of my colleagues who's actually going to be talking at the Gordon conference as well, Claire, is found some really interesting like Raman maps and Raman variation, looking at different things like marcasite and pyrite and trying to tell them apart because often they're kind of ignored. So I don't know if you've ever looked at like other technologies like Raman or other kind of ones like that before.
Yeah, I haven't worked directly with that yet, but we do have a Raman lab at Berkeley. My advisor, Penny Weezer, runs that and has worked a lot in looking at basically composite Raman applied to fluid and melt inclusions.
Yeah.
But we've actually been doing some testing recently to look at kind of different sorts of minerals and how we can use Raman to identify them. We've mainly been looking at apatite so far.
Oh
But I
yeah.
know there were some difficulties about like with orientation of the sample. So you kind of have to find ways to kind of orient your sample in all kind of crystallographic directions before you sort of are able to kind of match spectra exactly. But that's definitely a line of research that I'm quite interested in. And it would be cool
Yeah.
to work with that a bit more.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of potential that way for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
So despite appearances, this amazingly is not a conference on mineralogy, for example, or petrology, or even the ins and outs of different types of analytical techniques. It could be, but actually it's hugely important. And thank you so much, Sarah, for kicking us off this afternoon with all of this, because this is really exciting research. Because the more we can actually understand about those rocks, the more we can understand about where there may be minerals and metals in the ground, but also other things that might be interesting to extract. And that is where one of the ways in which we do enhance our certainty or our confidence in terms of what might actually be in the ground, but also what might be going on with regards to water, other aspects with regards to the environment, and of course, going on into human beings as well. So with that, Sarah, thank you so much. It's a brilliant way to start off this session. Round of applause, everybody, for the fabulous Sarah Shi. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, mate. So we're now going to change gear quite significantly. We're going to remove all the spotlights, etc., and we're going to bring the fabulous Burak to the stage. Now, Burak does not come from a geoscience background, unless you've been hiding that from me, Burak. Burak is going to take us in quite a different direction, but still thinking about the world of certainty, uncertainty, but very much more in that world of real estate and infrastructure. Burak, over to yourself.
Thank you, Sarah. So I was just thinking about this. How do I follow after Sarah and Sarah? But I'll do my best, right? I guess from Sarah's presentation, if you think of the whole value chain, when you think about understanding the rocks, I'm going to try to pivot all the way to the other end to kind of think about the clients, the use cases for those rocks and the use cases for those minerals. And then in terms of demand, where do we sit? So when I read the title, I was also a little confused. I have to admit, living in the uncertain times, somebody quoted, the famous quote about the best of times, these are the worst of times. So there are loads of things we can look for where we can kind of find opportunity and hope. And there are also many things, as you said, we kind of takes us into darker corners. I guess the thing that I wanted to focus on is that in a place of uncertainty, the only thing that we can control is what we do, is what we commit. And from a space of, coming from a place of kind of client place from real estate and infrastructure, what I would like to really speak to you about is the role of responsible materials in that space and what we can control and what we cannot and what we can influence. But to start with, I would like to talk about this from a context perspective. And my presentation is going to be a lot less technical. So I just apologize for that upfront. I don't know, this was kind of mind-blowing to me just to do a bit of research that I wasn't also aware, even though I have been in the sector for 25 plus years, is 40 to 50% of extracted raw materials globally are used by the construction industry. It is the largest consumer of steel, nearly accounting 50% of global steel demand. But you don't hear about us. We are not visible to a lot of people. It just happens. Buildings just get built, bridges are built, tunnels are made. So when you think about our industry, just in the UK, steel, concrete, aggregates are mainly majority of our materials. UK construction produces 62% of total waste, even though we have very high recycling rates. And what we send to landfill in the UK is just something like 5 to 10%. But most projects achieve 90-95% recycling of non-hazardous waste, but that still counts for 32% of all waste. So we are a very large industry who is very, very wasteful. I'm not looking at extracting those minerals and materials and raw materials, but I'm talking about how we use them. Majority of our raw material suppliers come from UK. And so we do, as a construction industry, are very good in terms of utilizing resources in the UK, Europe, and obviously from Asia. But I'm not sure if this was discussed, but all those rare minerals challenges, from a human rights risk, whereas DRC with cobalt or Chilean mines with lithium, they're also applicable to us because we are 40% of global emissions as an industry. And decarbonizing construction is a major challenge that is one of those really hard to abate sectors. And obviously we rely on steel and we rely on other industries and transport, and we employ millions of people across the globe, if not billions of people. Construction typically in economics is the largest employer when you think about in terms of creating employment. So we are a major consumer, and equally there are plenty of competing priorities. There is a lot of old school thinking, assuming that there are still plenty of raw materials. I must admit, this is a sectoral problem we have. We are very traditional in the way we approach things, and a lot of our thinking hasn't shifted. I think what's also happening is that there are plenty of economic headwinds. We are multiple layers away from the raw materials and mining. When I sit in a client role or support a client, advising them, they are dealing with a tier one contractor who's dealing with a wholesaler, who's dealing with a manufacturer. Then there is refinement of those materials. And then you might end up in the mine that actually extracts it. So in many ways, we hold our tier one contractors accountable, but we are just not close enough to those mining risks as much as our site risks. And in terms of general understanding of it, I would say that a lot of people in our supply chain, our understanding of the whole custody of chain in the construction sector is generally very poor. There is, we're dealing with high levels of waste, high levels of unproductivity as a sector. So we have plenty of headaches already as a sector, which is right in front of our eyes. In addition to that, we need to justify our actions to our paymasters. Typically in real estate, paymasters are private investors and private families or banks or lenders. And in terms of infrastructure, they're all of you. They're the taxpayers. So it's very interesting that we do have a lot of opportunity to go all the way down to the into the chain, but we seem to just really focus as an industry mainly on what we can see. However, there's hope, there's opportunity. In our industry, everywhere you look at, whenever there has been change, it came from the investors and the clients. And what contractors most of the time do in the UK, you might know this, but many contractors operate in very, very, very tight margins. So they only really do things when the clients ask for it or regulation makes them do it. And that's a very cynical view to say that, but there are, of course, some leading contractors that we work with and I have worked with, but majority of the industry feels very, very constrained and feels under a lot of pressure. Despite these setbacks, though, let me start talking about decarbonization, which I think is quite an interesting thing for us to hook onto, is that despite all the negative news, there is still strong public support. There's a piece of research from King's College that 64% of UK population is still supporting net zero. Depends on what your definition is. The UK government is still driving this agenda, especially with the new energy crisis after crisis. Green premium still exists in the building sector. There's better understanding of sustainability. There are legally binding, DCO grants, and some private investors. I mean, mainly these are the pension funds and some other, socially conscious investors do want to make sure that the whole supply chain, not the people that's just in front of your eyes, are actually looked after and they're taken care of, and the environment is considered. On the other hand, urbanization infrastructure is not going away. Right now, UN says 45% of the world lives in cities, and it's going to go up to 70% by 2050. And we do have a good record when it talks about, actually, if we put our mind to it, if you look at safety on UK sites, what we have achieved. So there is hope. But one thing that I can tell you for sure is that we are competing with any other industry, and we definitely are going to need more resources, and our demands are only going to grow. So that's the context. And when you take that context, how do we make this work, right? So I've been thinking, one of the major challenges in our industry is the disconnect between economics, environment, and social factors. And one way where responsible materials can actually really become a high priority topic in our industry is connecting with decarbonization and just transition. So I had a call this week and I mentioned this topic, and I believe this person is attending this conference. She mentioned ethical decarbonization. I really like that phrase, because if you consider that, we have to take care of multiple elements of it. And is this possible? Absolutely possible, because we already have started to design out emissions, therefore build less, need less resources. There is low carbon machinery, low carbon energy. These are expensive for the moment, but it will change. We can build with less materials. We can have less emissions and lower cost. And we can minimize waste management in terms of maximizing modularity and design for disassembly. So usually in our industry, we always look to the end, and because a building lifespan is like 30, 40, sometimes 100 years, average UK house is pretty old. But actually where we can make the biggest difference is upfront in terms of design and in terms of how we think about it. But just like embodied carbon, that's also something for us to think about, is I was thinking of the word embodied human rights. Everywhere you walk, every building you see, there's embodied carbon. But are we really thinking about, in terms of the embodied human rights, the impact on the human beings of that building, the copper that was used, or the steel where it came from, or the coal that was used to make that steel, or the sand sources? So generally, in conclusion, what I want to share with you is that real estate sector is generally behind public infrastructure. And you could kind of understand that because simply it's public spend. Therefore, people want to kind of think about that in terms of, greater good. It's actually a bit shocking. Like even new regulations in the UK, kind of leading regulations. I don't know if you know, there's a standard called Future Home Standard. This is all about us getting ready for, decarbonizing our new homes. They are about superior building fabrics, but not about responsible raw materials. And when you think about standards like LEED or BREEAM, I had a good chat to a very good friend of mine thinking about this, and he told me he worked for multiple major programs like I did, and he said that he got BREEAM excellent rating without even significantly thinking about raw materials. And then when you think of chain of custody standards, except with our obsession with timber and, woods and trees, all the other things in the chain, when it's about steel, rebar, concrete, all these chain of custody standards are very, very immature. So in many cases, clients, neither the clients nor the contractors really truly understand where their materials are really coming from. I had worked with a colleague who worked at London 2012 like me, and he worked in the velodrome, and obviously some of the material, the wood came from Siberia, and they were really concerned about it. But it's very, very specific to certain materials. It's not something that's done systematically. So in the infrastructure space, what we really need to do is move from paperwork to active risk management, and that's something that happens a lot. These big projects are fantastic about creating responsible procurement handbooks, robust procurement evaluation criteria, loads of systems. But what I would love to see more and more is people actually going out there on a modern slavery risk assessments and responsible procurement audits, actually going deeper and deeper into the supply chain to take greater responsibility. Because I genuinely think because they're public money, they actually have more license to do this in many ways and lead the way. Finally, what I would like to say is that I think there's a general opportunity, because right now everybody wants to do more with less. There's a greater focus on resilience and self-reliance, and strategic sourcing of raw materials is a hot topic. And net zero is a problem that we have and we have to solve if we do want to continue to live in this planet, whether we like it or not, or whether you agree with it or not. So I think in order to solve that, there are many, many solutions, but there are always things that people think about. One of the key things that I want to leave you with is two key misunderstandings. When people think about construction sector, they think about it's just construction. But just in the two segments of real estate and infrastructure, I try to explain to you the different dynamics and the complexities of it. And when we think about human rights in construction context, it is very much multi-layered. There is modern slavery of workers, there's community rights, there is supply chain, and therefore the raw materials. There is safety on sites. I must say, human rights is not really a topic that's in the kind of forefront of a lot of conversations. When I just literally came out with the phrase embodied human rights, it's really not part of the conversation. And what's really part of the conversation in terms of hooks is safety. So one thing that I have found out is that if you can kind of hook on to what safety has done, what we have achieved in the last 20 years when it regards to safety, I genuinely think there's a lot of lessons we can learn, the achievements we have done delivering large projects with very low injury rates. There is a lot of learnings we can gain from that. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I hope it was interesting.
Burak, it wasn't just interesting, it was absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. Before I get to the concept of embodied human rights, which by the way just destroyed my messaging systems because everybody just went, wow, that's an amazing term. Yes, please. Why do you think the likes of construction, but it's not just construction, it's people making batteries, all kinds of things. Why do you think everybody forgets about the raw materials or doesn't include them when they are mapping out their supply chains or just doesn't talk about them? Why is that?
I mean, I have my own views, but I genuinely think it's really out of sight, out of mind, Sarah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it's also, I think, because most of us in client roles and other roles, we don't feel empowered. We don't feel that we have the level of influence. So let me put it this way. If you're dealing with another industry where you might have a Google or your Nike, who's very prominent in that sector, right? If they make a decision and they want to change their supply chain and they decide to do that, they can do that because they have the buying power and they also have the reputation to go with it.
Mm-hmm.
In our industry, we are so fragmented. There is no Google in construction. There is nobody at that scale and size. If you look at main contractors, we are very small compared to all large European contractors, but even those are very small when you think about purchasing power and ability to shift the sector. So what you would need to shift the sector, you would have to bring such a large group of people moving in the same direction rather than, moving, I don't know, 10 major firms in a market that they might have a majority of share. So that is the biggest challenge, is that we don't have, individually, we don't have the buying power. And certainly it pretty feels very much, I think, feels for many people out of sight, out of mind.
And with that as well, so, I mean, the construction industry, I mean, is huge, but as you said, it's fragmented. It's very difficult to get it to shift. But it's not just about the raw materials that you need coming in, because a lot of, I mean, if we think about what is the biggest source of exciting raw materials in the UK, and the answer is London. But those raw materials are much more valuable being in all the buildings, etc., all the copper wiring, etc., like that, than by knocking it down and starting again. But in terms of the waste side of things, so when you knock down a building, is there a shift within construction to be designing for that circularity, etc.? Is that coming, or is it just one or two actors who are thinking, you know what, we're going to pay because it's going to cost us a bit more money, but we know that we're working in a sustainable way? Is that here yet, or not really?
It is coming, but as like many things, it's not moving fast enough, right?
Yeah.
Neither is decarbonization agenda. So, for example, there are many leading developers who are doing it. There are examples of that from offices, and more opportunity to retrofit. And also there are some leadership, like I was just checking, Westminster City Council has passed a new policy called Retrofit First. So there are some positive changes in terms of, and people start talking about urban mines and those kind of things, but in many cases, retrofit today starts to also make more sense because of cost pressures we have.
Yeah.
Right. And it also depends which segment of the market you're talking about, because at the moment, believe it or not, Cat A or top end offices are still a fairly buoyant market in London, right? Those things about working from home, that has not killed the city in terms of office space that's needed, but it's at the top end. What's going to happen, sadly, I was just talking to a real estate developer yesterday, is he's already seeing plenty of assets, plenty of buildings that are starting to become stranded assets, which will have those locked in minerals and all those quantities of aggregates in them. But at the moment, it's so hard to kind of change their uses, and it's so difficult to do that. They might remain that way until we realize, like you said, hold on, there is a lot of value hidden there.
Yeah, brilliant. So going back to then the primary raw materials for a second, and thinking about the embodied human rights. How big is that scope of embodied human rights in a building?
It's just, I mean, if you think about it, think about all the chain that I mentioned, right? Everybody in the chain is part of that human rights chain, all the way to the mining of the raw materials. Everybody's in it. It's the drivers, it's the security guards, it's the cleaners in the office, it's the people working in the mines. It's everybody in that chain. And if you can stretch that, you realize that you are touching so many people across the globe. And if you think about the fact that construction consumes nearly 50% of all raw materials, there is a huge opportunity, but there are plenty of barriers.
So coming back to how do we try and get some of this shift? Because as you said, 50% of all of the raw materials, of course, most of that from a bulk perspective are the aggregates, etc. What is there anything that we can do to help the world of construction make that shift? You've described it being really fragmented, etc. But if we can get construction to make that shift, then the demand for more responsible raw materials, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for someone to say, hey, I want nickel with a low carbon footprint, for example. And so that pull that can come from it, that would be amazing. But is that possible, or what can we do to try and make it possible?
I think data is key. At the moment, we cannot talk about human rights if we don't know what we're talking about.
Okay.
Right. So anything that there are, and the direction to go with is our focus on decarbonization. Steel is a great example. We are having material certificates, and materials need to have emissions and other factors. And the more we can collect that data, the more we can actually quantify it, the more we can make it visible, the more likely it will end up one day. Imagine that one day we build these things called BIM models. Imagine that you have, and we talk about, we have potentially virtual buildings. Imagine if you actually bought a building and you bought it with the knowledge of both embodied carbon and embodied human rights, the true cost of building that building.
Yeah, brilliant. So Barak, thank you so, so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And as you can see, this is always the case with this conference. We start off in the depths of geoscience, and then we go all the way to the other end, and we talk about, well, why do we even care? Because we need to use these materials. We have this demand for these materials. Barak, thank you so, so much. It was absolutely brilliant to see you. Round of
Thank you.
applause. Brilliant. Okay, so moving on from the fantastic Barak, we're actually going to go to the amazing Melody, who had actually posted a question in the chat about traceability. Well, Melody, my apologies for not coming to you immediately.
I think that he answered it. I really do. I think that the last section, the last conversation that you were having was really about that exact issue.
Yeah, no,
So.
absolutely, absolutely. And so I think with that, Melody, would you like to introduce yourself, because you come at all of this from yet another direction in terms of the world of raw materials?
Absolutely. And I really do come at this from an international development professional perspective. And I think also it's important for me to note that the bulk of my time working, especially with USAID, I was largely in biodiversity conservation, climate change mitigation, and climate change adaptation. So I think that a lot of people will think automatically that I am maybe anti-mining. That I would come from a perspective of saying, oh, we shouldn't be doing this, it's damaging. And I would echo some of what Barak was talking about in terms of embodied human rights and just how complicated the sector gets in general. And just to focus on that traceability aspect a little bit, I think that we struggle with that in so many things, particularly in critical minerals. The traceability issues are huge, particularly in certain regions of the world where it gets really hard to below the smelting. Below the smelting, that traceability becomes a real problem. But I wanted to thank Barak because I think that he talked a lot about things that I could talk about. But what I'd like to say is that I don't come from a perspective of, we should be limiting mining or zero mining. I'm really coming from a place of, we need to think about mining as a sector that matters, as a sector that should have more transparency and that more people should be aware of what really happens on the ground. Mining is really important for growth in mineral-rich countries. It's really important for the energy transition, and I think that that's something that certainly in my profession is a constant topic. And it's really important for the communities who live where the gold and copper and iron ore and all of these other things happen to be. I think that what we often get is we're not getting the projects that we actually need, the ones that hold together for investors, for communities, and for host countries. And so those kinds of projects, the ones that really hold together for all of these different stakeholders, they're succeeding where a lot of what I've seen over the course of the past 15 to 20 years, they are failing. And so here I would just talk about this idea of certainty. And I liked, again, the comment about certainty versus uncertainty. And I'm not sure I would necessarily argue that very hard. But I think that I'd rather talk about that idea of absence of risk, or because it's very difficult to overcome all risks, having a credible model for navigating risks. And I think the biggest threat to certainty in mineral projects really comes above the ground. It's a development question and an investment question joined together. And I think that, we learned certainly from Sarah's talk that the term certainty definitely means different things to different people. And I really loved her talk. It was super interesting. So let's talk about different kinds of vantage points on that, on certainty and risk. So if you're an investor, you might be thinking about returns and timelines. How can you model assets? How can you put a number on it? Operator certainty, maybe more about execution, hitting milestones, not being blindsided by some event that nobody could have really predicted. Certainly, the host government has a different perspective. Does the project deliver on revenue, jobs, infrastructure, advancing national strategy, and more importantly, not becoming a political liability? And then communities, risks, and uncertainty. And in my experience, this receives insufficient investment, insufficient attention. Do the people who live next to a project who are relocated because of it benefit directly, or at least not lose because of a project? And I think that issues in this area are apparent at the community level quickly and will have significant impacts on success. I mean, and all of the other levels of certainty up the chain. Now, I mean, these areas really don't align perfectly, but you really want to work towards alignment and towards mutual benefits. So breakdowns. I really see several areas of failure modes. And I don't think anybody here would be surprised on what they are. So and in my experience, looking at the projects where I've worked and, pretty heavily across West and Central Africa, it doesn't take very long. Talk to like one or two stakeholders and almost predict what's going to happen. And so we can just talk about some of them, administrative holdups. Permits don't get stuck because of paperwork, in my experience. They get stuck because of shifting politics. Were the connections sufficient? Did people have enough intelligence to understand what might change and what might happen? Was there too much optimism? Optimism, I think, is one thing I see quite a lot. And do you ignore the context telling you where things might not work out the way you're planning, especially in timelines? And I think that, there's specific examples of major mining projects, certainly in West Africa, where you see a timeline of like 10 years and multiple permitting regimes over different administrations. So then, we have elite capture. I think that this is a big risk area. So did you negotiate your permits with a minister who may not survive a cabinet reshuffle? That's real exposure. And from a development standpoint, that's a social contract signed with one or maybe a few people and not with a country or the communities that'll be most impacted and frankly stand to lose the most. And then we have local grievance. Grievances rarely end cleanly. Water, power disputes, these become national news stories. They become major risks to investment, reputation. The cost of catching those signals early is relatively small, but the cost of catching it late is really big for all parties, and especially for communities whose grievances were very real to begin with. And this can come in the shape of insufficient planning, communications, execution of relocation operations, infrastructure development, resource access restrictions. Those are just a couple of things. Workforce disputes are another one. And then the last, and I think that this is really consistent, is an unrealistic assumption about who has the most influence on the ground. It's difficult sometimes to know that without a lot of groundwork, a lot of time spent understanding traditional authority, informal networks. Sometimes diaspora dynamics come into play, religious leadership, elite capture again. And sometimes these matter more than formal connections made in planning. So I'll make one of those concrete. A company can be excellent at operations, really good at safety and security protocols, really good at the infrastructure development necessary. And they do everything right on paper, right? ESG planning, engagement plans, community investment commitments, they're all budgeted, but they don't have capacity and haven't made the effort to invest in their soft skills, to build the unit within their ranks, to forge and maintain relationships, to ensure co-benefits and ensure information flow. I saw one mine cycle through staff within this department because they really hadn't properly invested in the function. In one case, the first iteration of the team embezzled the budget. They were replaced by a small group with better experience, but no requisite language skills. So that didn't work out. And then, to rectify the situation, they actually pulled an engineer from the mining operation to try to set things right. It's not the best workable solution. And what you're seeing here is a mine that really is trying to do the right thing, not being able to make good on their commitments on the timeline that's expected. And it just starts to create that tension. So I also think that, just one quick observation is that the energy transition is making things harder in a lot of ways. I think that mineral demand is rising in a way that I don't think maybe we've experienced before. And any speed games have a high likelihood of coming at the expense of engagement work that might de-risk projects. So, how do we try to overcome some of this? I'd say we really need to put the work in on the ground first, map the actors, map the, you need the influence map. Who matters? Why do they matter? What do they want? What are they afraid of? It not only does it need to be done rigorously, it needs to be kept current, because the landscape can change in a lot of these mineral rich regions very quickly. We cannot take stability for granted. And then, we need to identify triggers. There's a set of events that, if they happen, will materially change the operating environment. Elections, for example, commodity prices, local leadership transition, transboundary issues, a natural disaster or a disease outbreak, read COVID or Ebola. We have to be planning for those triggers in advance and decide what that means for the project at the outset. Testing scenarios is important. It's not generic risk registers, but locally grounded scenarios that connect political and social events to the operational realities. What happens if a minister loses their portfolio? If a key local leader passes away, what's that continuity plan? What does community investment commitment look like with new leadership, for example? And then, making sure that you've built engagement pathways. Trust is not a campaign, it's relationships and feedback loops. And I'll say, from the development perspective side, the early signals they're there. Civil society networks, community-led monitoring, human rights documents are having long before they might come and actually complain directly. And I think that, again, this goes back to talking about really that early investment and investing in your soft skills. I can tell you that during my time with USAID, multiple times mining companies would come to USAID and say, hey, we're having this major issue, and we haven't budgeted properly, and can you come and help us with this? I mean, as a foreign assistance donor at the time, you're not able to solve all of the problems. There are partnership arrangements that USAID definitely engaged with, that I think, in my personal capacity, that I think were helpful. But, having those early investments in soft skills is just critical. and you cannot get by without it. The exposure is real. I'm sorry, I could drone on about this for a very long time, but I want to give you a chance to interact with me.
No, Melody, this is absolutely fantastic and fascinating. And I guess the thought that is sitting in my mind at the moment, so I'm lucky in that I get to work with lots of different exploration and mining project development companies, as well as the mining companies. And the majority of the exploration companies, when you start talking about grievances, human rights, etc., you get blank looks coming back at you. They just don't know why this is important. And I wonder, the problem is as well is because often they're very small companies, they don't have a lot of money to spend, and the priority for them is on, well, we want to go and check out if there are juicy rocks in the ground, and if there are, then we'll start doing this stuff. And that's the problem, because actually it's almost like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg?
I just think that you find yourself in a quagmire, because once you start looking, right, you're already raising expectations. The expectations are there almost immediately, and the forces that will come around to try to be part of and benefit from a project are already there, and understanding all of those different dynamics is important really early on. I mean, I've seen mines, because again, mines can be really incredible drivers of economic growth. I've seen them increase stability, really increase the attractiveness of, moving to an area and like capacity building, and, it can be really impressive. Um, but you're looking at population growth in ways that are are not known yet. And, this is where you get into that scenario planning and really trying to think through what it means for, I mean, relocation, for, water quality, for, food security. I mean, these are basic things that can really change in a region.
So Melody, let's imagine we're in a world where you're actually the CEO of an exploration company.
Oh dear.
But how would you do it? How would you start to work out, like, well, where do I go? Would you come at this from that above ground risk perspective and then go, right, I've kind of got all of that information. Now let's bring in that geological understanding and that map and where those two things intersect. Right, off we go. I mean, how would you do it?
I mean, it's complicated, right? I mean, this is why, you were saying that it's art, when Sarah was talking. Well, I mean, this is art. Um, I think that really getting good local contacts, and I don't mean starting in a capital city necessarily, because you need to understand regional, ethnic, linguistic differences and how they interact. And so I do think it is really worthwhile to get some good solid intelligence from the outset, and to be thinking about how to maintain contacts and how to maintain maintain sort of that momentum. And I think that another thing is trying to understand a bunch of different weird things like land tenure. Land tenure is really complicated. And, you can have people popping up who think they have a claim, maybe not official, maybe not, formal, but informal land claims are also really important. And so kind of getting a sense of some of the real big flashing issues that you might find before you start to raise expectations, because things get much more complicated when there's money.
Absolutely. Melody, I could sit asking you questions all day, because I think this is absolutely fascinating. But unfortunately, we've reached our time, and I'm just going to say a massive thank you on behalf of all of us for coming along today and blowing our minds with so much information. That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Melody. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Excellent. So next, everybody, we are going to welcome to the stage the fantastic Gavin Mudd. Now, Gavin is the man who holds the pen behind the UK critical minerals assessments, but you don't just plot where minerals and elements, etc., sit on a map. You do a lot more than that, don't you, Gavin? And so everyone, I'm going to ask you to put your hands together for the fantastic Gavin Mudd. Over to you, Gavin.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Let's get some slides shared. And hopefully technology is nice. Now, let me just, this should be, okay. Is that coming through properly? I don't
That is perfect, Gavin. It's almost like you've done it before.
Excellent, good. I'm a obviously well-experienced Zoom user. What I want to talk through today is just give you a sort of an oversight of some of the broad body of work we do. So now we're a project at BGS, at the British Geological Survey, the Critical Minerals Intelligence Centre, which we deliver for the Department of Business and Trade here in the UK. And that's basically to support both DBT and the broader UK government around anything they need help with on critical minerals. So for us, our headline sort of project is often the criticality assessment, where we go through and pull together as much objective data as we can to quantify global supply risk and look at what that means in terms of the use of different minerals and for the UK economy and vulnerability to potential supply disruptions, which of course is much more topical right at the moment. And then we pick a threshold and decide what's critical and what's still important, but not critical. Another major area we've done a lot of work in is looking at foresight, basically looking at the demand in the future for different critical minerals for different technologies. We've done several reports now looking mainly at decarbonisation technologies, such as electric vehicles, wind turbines, and related sort of technologies. And saying, well, based on the build out of those technologies in the UK to achieve net zero, what does that mean for the amount of critical minerals that are required? Now, within that, we always keep a good close eye, and based on statistics and data sets that BGS has been doing for well over a century now in terms of looking at global mining and smelting and refining, but also going further downstream now. It's something BGS has been doing a lot more recently, is not just starting at the rock. We have a saying from our director that everything starts with a rock, and everything truly does. I mean, I think, as I point out, even farming starts with a rock, because rocks weather the soils, and soils what we grow our food on. So yes, even farming starts with rocks. But what we need to understand is not just the data, and I think this is the thing that's been wonderful to listen to the presentations in this session, is that it's not just about data, it's about underlying issues, it's about the trends, it's about, and again, that art of actually trying to explain the data and help people make, I suppose, good decisions based on that. Now, another major area, and this is work that's led both within CMIC, but also a lot of other work done in parallel within other BGS projects, is of course the circular economy. And that can be looking at different supply chains, looking at, say, the UK supply chains for permanent magnets, but then also looking at what that means to support things like circularity and understanding stocks and flows. And I'll show you some examples of that. And of course, the other thing we do is looking at particular commodities. It could be tungsten. It could be all sorts of others, like hafnium, for example. But then looking at particular countries. So why should the UK, in terms of its international partnerships, be thinking about certain countries for and what are the critical minerals that might be worth looking at there? And we might look at particular regions as well, like the lithium triangle or other things and so on. So we pretty much span the spectrum from the start of the rocks right to the secondary resources that we want to recycle and try and quantify everything in between. Of course, when we think about that in words, it's one thing, but to think about it visually, we have our own data for the mining and often refining stages at BGS, one of the very few geological surveys globally that does do that independently. We then take different metals or minerals, perhaps, sometimes chemicals, chemical forms, that gets transformed into different components or different parts. They get assembled together into different products or technologies of which we use them. And then eventually, of course, that becomes end-of-life waste. Or it may be reused, repurposed, or fully recycled in different ways. Now, as we go down this supply chain, of course, the amount of data publicly available generally becomes a lot less. And so we have to work out how to either make assumptions or talk to different stakeholders to try and find some useful data and so on. But that's the job. That's what we do, and that's we like to think we do a pretty reasonable job. One of the projects we had last year, in the last financial year, that is, up till sort of March, was what we call our waste and scraps project, where we explored copper and we explored tungsten, and we looked at what's been happening in the UK. Now, because BGS has been collecting statistics on mineral production, imports and exports into the UK or out of the UK for over 100 years, we can actually put a graph like this together, where the top half is all of the imports. So the darker green is refined copper. So that's ready to go straight into different components or parts, perhaps. And then the unrefined copper that maybe comes out of a smelter and just needs to be refined to make it useful. And tiny bits of other forms there as well. On the bottom, you can see the changes over the years from different forms, whether it be chemical forms such as copper sulfate that are exported, and the rise since the 1970s really of waste and scrap. Now, we don't know the copper content of that. We suspect it's probably 90–95% copper, for example. But we can see the big rise, after the closure of the James Bridge Copper Works in Birmingham, and that was 1999. And so UK reached almost 400,000 tonnes or so of contained copper being exported, when we're only importing probably 30 or 40,000 tonnes at that time. It's since declined a bit, but for the last 20–25 years, the UK is a net copper exporter. And that's a pretty remarkable thing to say when we're thinking about the impacts of copper mining and listening to the previous speakers. And we're thinking about whether it's the embodied human rights of that copper, all of these types of things. So I guess that means there's a really good circular economy opportunity in copper in the UK. When we looked at tungsten, basically the tungsten picture is not as simple, much more complicated and needs a lot more work. But it looks what's coming in equals roughly what's coming out. And but again, that report is now available. This is from work that we're releasing probably mid to late May, and this is work that's been led by Evi Petrovrazzi, my colleague at BGS. And what we're doing is saying, well, we've already done the foresight work to look at the future growth of technologies such as EV traction motors, the drivetrains, the batteries, the solar photovoltaics, and so on. So we can start to then predict, well, if they last 10 to 15 years, in 10 to 15 years, as those technologies reach their end of life, we will get that as a secondary flow, right? So therefore, we can start to predict actually what's available for recycling when, and potentially in what form and so on as well. Now, from some of the work that's been done, you can see the sort of the rise in demand, and this is the transition in action. We can see the sort of neodymium as the top graph there, and a couple of different scenarios to account for some uncertainties around that. So we can see the rise and then basically the saturation of that technology in the UK by the time you get to the mid-2030s. By the 2040s, mid-2040s, and certainly by 2050, it certainly looks like the supply of secondary neodymium could meet that primary demand. Now, as Evi would say and explain very eloquently, of course, there's a lot of caveats around that. But from a systems point of view, it allows us to start to think through, well, what's possible and then actually, based on these numbers and this sort of modeling work, what do we need to have in place when, whether that's a technology, whether that's a policy, and then start to think about what this might mean in terms of some of the economics and other aspects as well. We can certainly see with the lithium graph on the bottom right there, very similar dynamics. All right, so certainly the UK Critical Mineral Strategy, Vision 2035, it has ambitions of about 20% for recycling. And so it's into the circular economy. So I think we're on track in many ways. But again, it's difficult, and whether we can meet it for every commodity, I suppose that's part of the work that we still need to be doing. But again, this will be released probably mid to late May. Another thing we've done in the last year, and I, as someone who has published across most of the periodic table, I always love an excuse to sort of, do things like that. But quantum computing, if we're thinking about the future of the digital transition, we're starting to hear a lot more about this concept of quantum computing. And so it's something that we've thought is, obviously it's coming. And rather than reacting to something that's, already happening and we're struggling to sort of catch up, we're trying to look forward with this project. And so what we're looking at, not only a lot of the elements that we need for quantum computing are things like cesium, rubidium, and they're all byproducts. Or scandium we might be able to use as well, but as well as a lot of the traditional elements that we see right across the spectrum when it comes to electronics. But we can see I've just chosen to plot 3 countries here over the last sort of 75 years and their share of that different commodity. We can see obviously the rare earths where you've got a lot of China, the platinum group elements where there's a lot of South Africa, and then you can see other elements where you've got a strong influence, say, from Australia, such as zirconium and others as well. Now, the problem here is this is just looking at the mine supply. What we're not being able to show, and I think this is one of always the devil's in the detail, is that we also need to think about high purity materials. For some of the uses of things like gallium, you need 9 nines. Now, for people who are not familiar with that concept, if we say that something has 2,9 purity or 2N purity, that's 2 nines. So, in other words, 99%. 4 nines would be 99.99%. And 6 nines would be 99.9999%. So if we're looking at 99% purity, that's 1 part per billion of impurities that are allowed. All right, so that's the level of high purity that is sometimes needed for certain functionalities, especially in some quantum computing components, but also other electronics technologies and so on as well. That doesn't really, it's not easy when you're dealing with criticality assessment and things like that. Sometimes there's only a few companies in the world that might be capable of producing such materials at that sort of high quality. But the other thing that also is probably even harder to do actually is the isotopic purity. If we look at some of the elements based on their spin characteristics, they can sometimes create noise, and so that affects the sort of quantum behavior. So if you're looking at elements like whether it's germanium and others, we need isotopically pure, things like nitrogen and so on as well. So not only do we need an increasing spread of elements that we haven't relied on to date, we need increasingly high purity, but then also isotopic purity in order to get that quantum functionality for that particular component. So I think, as I've said before, I think we think it's complicated now with respect to things like criticality and what's on our critical minerals list. I think it's going to get much more difficult because we have to increase the sort of the level of complexity that we're starting to think about. So again, this report is due to be released probably mid to late May, once we're past the current election period in the UK. At the moment, of course, there's a lot of disruption going on to different, certain supply chains around the world, whether that be oil and gas, whether that be helium. We've had a major, about 1/3 of the world's helium is produced out of Qatar, and that facility has been severely damaged. But it's not just about that. Sulfuric acid, about 15 to 20% of the world's sulfur is produced in the Gulf. And so that, of course, is the main ingredient for sulfuric acid, which is then used to help produce nickel, a critical mineral, and a whole range of other things, let alone other sectors that rely on things like fertilizers for agriculture, for example. So this is some work that we've been sort of progressing, looking at the UK, looking at the input-output data of the UK economy across different sectors. And so we can start to use the various standard industry classification codes that describe that. And then we can start to look at the networks and start to say, well, actually, if we impact one area, we could take the sort of the light brown area down in the bottom left there of this network. And that's a lot of our metals and things like that. So fabricated metal parts and all sorts of other things, electrical equipment. How does that flow on and then start to affect other parts of the UK economy? All right, and so this is sort of work that's sort of allied to sort of similar approaches that are being used in Europe, the US and elsewhere. But it starts to allow us a much more sophisticated capacity to really understand the impacts of supply disruption on things like the UK economy. So for us, I thought I'd just talk briefly about some of the work we've got planned for this year, or we're setting up. We're continuing to build a lot of our data capabilities, so expanding the amount of trade codes that we can analyze, and so putting justifying metal contents for a lot of different trade codes, continuing to build a lot of that economic analysis and that the use of networks to help us understand the stress testing of the UK economy, but also automation, building some of the digital infrastructure that we need to really help us to manage all of that and deliver things like the next criticality assessment. We're doing a couple of future outlooks, one on the medical side of things, so looking at medical technologies and pharmaceuticals if we can. We're just scoping that out at the moment. And it's not so much to think about the critical minerals that are in actual medicines, but actually the things like the catalysts and other chemicals, other critical minerals that are used to actually help make those in the first place. The other one is looking at the midstream stages and the various components used in a lot of the machine tools, the actual cutting tools, things like that, that go into actually making the various metal components that then go into advanced manufacturing and so on. So I think there's some really unique little opportunities in those. The decarbonisation foresights that we've done before, we haven't looked at grid scale batteries, and if we can look at whether it's exemplars like California or South Australia, we can see just how important batteries, storage systems are now really becoming. And again, it's providing better grid reliability, soaking up a lot of the renewable energy that's often delivered during the day with things like solar, and then providing cheap peaking power. South Australia earlier this year reduced their retail price of electricity by 35%. Now, I think if you were able to deliver that in many other parts of the world, I think there'd be a few bottles of champagne being popped open. Lastly, a couple of last things. One is we've got some funding now from the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office to actually do some joint work with France on tungsten and titanium supply chains, and looking at some of the trade, the gaps, and where the opportunities are to make sure we really improve the resilience of both the UK and France with respect to tungsten and titanium. And finally, as I mentioned before, where we do a lot of work around circularity, but one of the barriers that we see, and that a lot of people in this space also see, a regulatory system, our environmental approach to how we regulate things like waste, was very much from the old model of the economy, the linear model. So we dig up, we use, and then we dispose. And that doesn't really help us when it comes to a circular economy. So a lot of the way that we classify waste based on that approach is not really fit for purpose in terms of the modern way we want to think about things as a secondary resource, not just a waste. So rather than say exporting black mass, how can we actually make sure we consider that as a secondary resource rather than a waste? So that'll be a high-level review, and the ability to sort of progress that is basically that'll be a whole of government approach across the UK. So, but again, it's just setting up that sort of that trajectory so we can again help to facilitate and evolve the way we work towards, say, Vision 2035, the UK strategy. So for us, we're still working right across the supply chain, both work we do through CMIC or CMIC, but also the work we do through BGS. And as we've heard as well, the geopolitics is not something that we ignore. We have to be obviously very cognizant of that, because we know that there's more than enough rocks in the ground. There's different parts of the world that have the same rock sometimes. So we have more than enough resources to be able to achieve the goals we have with the different technologies and so on. It's managing and understanding a lot of that, whether it's geopolitical risk, and as we've heard with previous speakers as well, sometimes it's social risk, it may be technical risk, it can be all sorts of other things as well. And so we're trying to make sure we incorporate as much as we can of all of that so that we can help the UK improve its resilience for critical minerals. And I'm happy to leave it there and open up for questions. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Gavin. Absolutely fantastic, as always. Round of applause from everyone. We've got time for just a couple of questions. And I think the first one is, so firstly, the fact that we're a net exporter of copper, I think that graph is just genius, and certainly tells an amazing story. With regards to then where you showed things like a lot of the critical minerals that are coming through from batteries, and when they will reach the end of their life, and thinking, okay, how does that recycling then fill in that gap? Are those calculations done based on assuming 100% retention of those critical minerals, i.e. we will have stopped shipping them overseas, or where's the thinking there in terms of stopping that export of waste to other countries?
A lot of the work that Evie's done is basically modelling what's there and then what becomes available. And so I think a lot of it does assume that we stop exporting. Now, as I say, there's always caveats on that, and no process is thermodynamically ever 100% efficient.
Yeah.
So you're never going to be able to capture, even if you recycle every battery, you're still going to have some losses along the way, as you see in mining as well. We heard about recovery earlier. So I think understanding a lot of those assumptions in all of that I think always becomes really important. And one of the things that we often, we put a lot of time and careful thought into is how to present the results, because you've got so many different variables, so many different assumptions, how to make sure you present the results. And generally the way we've sort of built the work is sort of things like the minimum, maximum of the various scenarios. Right, and so that way you can get the sort of the window that you're sort of where things are going. So So there is, there is a lot of assumptions on that. But again, I think that's where it comes back to reinforcing to whether it's the DBT, but also, across the sort of the UK government, is if we want to be able to achieve this, then obviously we have to make sure we're processing things here. Now, we can only process things here, well, if we actually have the facility to do that, all right? And so at the moment, there's some big gaps in that. Now, we do have that, that capacity emerging for the permanent magnets, all right? We now have the Hypromag facility at Birmingham, and there's others, there's Ionic Technologies. But some of the other projects that we'd really like to see, one of the issues, whether it's energy costs, other things there, these are some of the challenges that we've got to work through to make it all happen. So there's a lot of different things to bring together to say, well, okay, if we stop exporting and we want to process it all, there's still a lot of other things to put in place to make sure it all happens.
Yeah. So just one more question, and that then builds on what you just said. So we want to be able to be processing this onshore, as it were. Now, the UK government has been signing various memorandums of understanding or kind of various agreements with other countries around the world. Is that being driven in a kind of opportunistic way? So from a government angle, where everyone goes, oh, great, yes, no, we can buddy up, we can sign something. Or is it being driven where we go, well, actually, we've got a real gap in that supply chain here within the UK. We really want to work with another country that either it might have the raw materials on the ground or it might having processing capability, etc. Are we seeing that joining up happening, or is it a bit more random?
I think we're seeing it joined up a lot more. I think part of the reason that we've been encouraged to sort of work more internationally, and we now have the funding in place to actually do the project with France as well, is precisely because that's what's needed. Now, it may be that the UK doesn't need to build a processing facility for everything, right? It says, well, France will do something, Germany will do other bits, and we map that out. But I think that's one of the key things that we always keep coming back to is we do have to plan that out. And I think, and that planning involves strategy. It involves understanding the landscape, the players, and all of that. And sometimes, there certainly can be some opportunities, little efforts put in place. And sometimes they can be really productive and actually really useful. But I think the most important thing is to really say, well, actually, there are some countries, as supplier nations, whether it be Australia, Canada, South Africa, and Brazil, and you could name others. And again, others depend on which mineral we're focusing on. But then there's others that are really good at the process technology, and the UK does have some excellent expertise in that, obviously. Others have the renewable energy or the other capacity to sort of supply the low carbon electricity or to actually run facilities or things like that. So I think the key thing that we always keep coming back to is this has to be deliberate. It has to be planned. And of course, why do we keep saying that? Well, look at what China's done. That's exactly what China's been doing for decades, for the last 40, 50 years, really, in terms of saying, well, actually, we'll mine where we can. What we can't mine, we'll import. But they then process, so smelting, refining, that connects to their, the manufacturing ecosystem, which then connects to their export, technologies and markets. And so they've built that ecosystem very deliberately and very, with a lot of hard work, and they've made mistakes, and there's still issues, right? But and that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But but I think that's the thing: strategy, being deliberate, and actually getting on with it.
Brilliant. Good moment to finish on that. But everyone, please put your hands together for the fantastic Gavin Mudd. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gavin. So good to see you. Brilliant. And next, in terms of, potentially pulling some of this together, there is no pressure here, by the way, Heather and Laurie. I'm not expecting you to draw all these strands together, but by checking out some of these aspects of how do we close that gap with regards to eco-efficient mining in that era of constraint, you can see some of these themes coming through already in this afternoon session. But please, I'd like to welcome to the stage the fantastic Heather and Laurie. And we can see your screen, which is absolutely beautiful. Everyone, please put your hands together for Heather and Laurie. Over to you.
Thanks so much. And hi, Laurie. How are you doing?
Yeah, well, thanks, Heather.
Opposite sides of the country, so it's always fun.
Yes.
Thank you for the invitation for us to participate today. We're going to just take a few minutes here today to explain a bit about our tiny nonprofit that we work for and dig into some of the area topics around water and tailings that really are part of the whole bigger picture we need to look at. When we were invited, we looked at the theme of this event, the theme of finding certainty in an era of change. Is so important, but from a Sikh perspective, and I was reflecting on it, actually, the word change may be the wrong one for us right now. It's constraint. Constraint is the big issue that we're looking at, and how do it's nowhere are these constraints sharper than in water and tailings. There's more pressure, there's more scrutiny, there's slower moving technology. Every site is different from the last. The fact that the diverse geologies and geographies and climate globally create such different challenges for water management, water stewardship, and our operational relationship with water, really, and its role with the regional communities. So how do we as an industry move forward on these topics together and make real change and find certainty in what we're doing with in our operations? And that's where our group is focusing. I believe there's already been a few presentations talking to these topics around water this week, and I will be going to look at them later. I was excited to hear about it. But it really makes sense that you're going to have multiple discussions on water in an event like this because it's such a critical priority. So I hope we're not too redundant, but really the intention of Seek is as a nonprofit, we're a global nonprofit dedicated to advancing eco-efficiency in minerals production. What that means is everything we do is open. We're about amassing knowledge, enabling collaboration, and addressing challenges together for the industry with the intention of trying to advance our performance and better our performance right around the world. We have the Global Water Initiative within our program, which really takes a 5-stream approach. That's what you're seeing on the screen right now. And that's through the GWI, we bring together technical experts, communities, and leaders aiming to make knowledge accessible so that decision makers and technology people can use it. Laurie, who's with me, leads a lot of Seek's water and tailings work within our groups, and with his own practice is also really globally recognized as an expert in these spaces. So we're pretty lucky to have him. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to ask Laurie a few questions, really try to pick his brain on these topics, and then we'll be open for any questions from others. So before we move on, Laurie, I was just wondering, do you have any other comments you'd make on the water wheel itself that we're looking at?
Yeah, thanks, Heather. So the water wheel, I guess, was a concept that we came up with as we were exploring what areas to focus on, etc. So Seek really started as a group of process engineers. We have a very metallurgy focus, etc. But getting into water, we realized it's much broader than just what type of flotation process or leaching process, etc. It needs to incorporate other aspects. And so in our more multidisciplinary engagement with people, we came up with these 4 segments that you see. So some of them focus on technology and innovation, water treatment and management, but also environmental aspects around environmental responsibility, as well as social consideration, stakeholder engagement, and all of that linked by interdisciplinary collaboration. I think Melody sort of spoke to this topic a little bit of social considerations in her talk, and that was very important. And I think that's been a really useful segment just to make sure we are looking at the water context holistically, and we're not just focused only on technical solutions. Yeah, that's probably my piece on the water wheel.
Thanks, Laurie. I'm going to stop sharing just so people can see our mugs more closely.
Sure.
Okay, so I have a few questions for you, Laurie. So hold on to your seat.
Yep.
We're going to get going. My first one was really from where you are sitting. What's the gap that you think matters the most in water and tailings right now? It's really between what's technically possible and what's actually being deployed. And is it really closing?
Yeah.
Or is
So tailings and water, as you said, are really key challenges for the industry. And I would say things are getting harder. The reason being that you hear on forums like this, we have declining ore grades, so you have to treat more ore to produce the same amount of metal, and in conjunction with that, demand is rising. So if you think about the amount of wastes that are coming out of the mining sector, or whether it be waste rock or tailings, the ground up products from processing that need to be stored, those are rising in terms of the bottom line quantities. And then water use is often linked to tailings production. So if we think about tailings, so they're like sand, silty type of materials, etc. The big three are really copper, gold, and iron ore. And the demand of all of those three is continuing to rise. So I would say that things are getting harder. So we've got to work faster. We've got to work harder just to keep up. And then we've got to be thinking about how we can reduce impacts. And some of the tailings facilities around the world are now in the billions of tons. So these are very large landforms that often contain a lot of water, and sometimes they fail and they kill people and they damage environments and so forth. So things are actually getting harder, I think. But in conjunction with that, I think the mining industry has been moving both on capital investment in certain known technologies, as well as doing some research, development, and implementation of newer technologies to, if you like, reduce the intensity or make tailings more benign, give ourselves more chance of creating landforms that are more manageable at closure and so forth. So on the waterfront, we've seen a lot of that in Chile, for example, with the desalination and pumping of water from the sea rather than using fossil groundwater uses and so forth. So that reduces water stress, but at a very high cost. But I think has allowed the copper industry in particular to expand its production without getting into major conflicts around water. On the tailings front, we're seeing a lot of movement around a movement towards coarser processing. And there's a couple of aspects of that. One is what we call coarse particle flotation. We do some of that investigation in the Global Water Initiative. So technologies like, for example, Aries HydroFloat, there's also the Jordan Novacell. Those are technologies that should allow mineral recovery to be maintained at much coarser sizes, so that then the waste we produce are more easily dewatered, that they're more easily managed, etc. So I think there's good things happening in that area. But the big thing really in the copper sector in particular is a movement towards heap leaching of a broader range of ores. So when Sarah gave her talk this morning, understanding mineralogy, etc., the mineralogy of an ore relates to the types of flow sheets we can use, and hence the wastes that are produced. We'll come back to that a little bit more in the talk. But for many, many decades, the copper industry has been trying to do heap leaching of coarser rocks, if you like, creating big stacks of ore that are more drainable, that we can leach, for example, with acid to extract copper. That sort of process has a much, much lower water footprint and also leaves behind more stable residues. So I think watch this space. That will be a significant shift and will help really sort of catch up with that trend of lower grade ores and so forth. So reducing intensity, both in the energy and water space, and better landforms.
Great, thank you. It's a lot. I find it such an interesting getting into this side of the industry. It's so complex. It's if you like to be challenged, it's the place to be working. Tell me, Laurie, when it comes to all of this, could you think of a water or a tailings project where real innovation is actually stuck? There's so many worries about the risks and worries if things will move forward. Do we have good examples yet? And if not, what killed it?
Yeah, okay. So I'll talk about a water project. And when we say innovation, I think sometimes we think about innovation like some technical gadget or something that's invented in a like a little university laboratory somewhere. But I also think innovations around how we work together to solve complex problems in different ways. So the example that I come back to on water is a project in Peru. And I think Aileen has a link to a report that I'll speak to. So this is a water, a wastewater plant that was built in Arequipa in Peru in conjunction with the expansion of the Cerro Verde mine. And so Cerro Verde, very, very large copper mine. And they were trying to secure water. Their choices were all expensive and not good. But in that community at that time, around the early 2010s, a lot of polluted water was going into the local river, the Chile River. And what the mining company realized is that rather than just them thinking about their boundaries and the project itself, they really needed to engage with a broader range of stakeholders, community interests, farmers, etc., and think about how to solve other bigger water issues in conjunction with securing supply. So they invested many hundreds of millions of dollars in the end in a large water treatment plant that took sewage and other wastewaters, cleaned up that water, produced better quality water downstream, and then took some of that treated water for the mine expansion. And overall, I think that's been a very, very good project. It still withdraws some water from the system, though, right? So not everyone's happy. And there are some trade-offs and compensations, but ultimately a much, much better solution than perhaps trying to force their way to access water and create a conflict. Or alternatively, the other alternative would have been desalination and pumping from the ocean. So I think that's innovation in the sense of how a mining company worked together with a much broader range of people to think beyond perhaps what you would normally narrowly look at. And I think that's an area that's really important. We need to be doing more of that.
Okay, thank you. The next thing I was thinking about is around risk. You know, mining as an industry, we're famously cautious. We so proudly say we want to be first to be second. It's a little annoying.
Yes.
And in water and tailings, consequences are big if we get it wrong. They're severe. So caution's rational. So in your view, where's the line between healthy risk aversion on one side and a caution that could actually make the industry less safe over time?
Yeah, look, I think I agree with you that the mining industry is typically quite cautious. I think there have been some mining companies that have invested in the long term in developing newer technologies. I started my career with Mount Isa Mines, which at that time was quite an innovative company, both in mining, underground mining technology, in mineral processing and in smelting, etc. But these things do take time. They take some commitment. It's not the sort of thing you often just buy off the shelf, right? So, but I think the key to advancing certain technologies and implementing them successfully, a lot of that comes down to collaboration. So collaboration with researchers, developing the right people who, I think in the mining space, you need applied researchers. So yes, there's a place for fundamental research, but you're really talking about applied research and how that can be, developed and can be robust and so forth and tested. But staying open to possibilities and thinking about how to share the risk. So I think where mining companies have been prepared to work more in an open source type of manner, if you like, and I know that's a theme of Seek. We like to do things open source because that way I think you give more room for all those possibilities and potential obstacles and challenges to be discussed and managed. And I think the risks in mining are too big for mining companies to try and go this alone. So I think that's very important. And to recognize that when a major technology shift occurs, so you see this, for example, we've seen it in the nickel industry some years ago with a shift towards high pressure acid leach type of technologies. The investments are huge, and sometimes things don't go well because perhaps companies didn't do the necessary homework around understanding the full system risks, perhaps because engineering companies were a little too optimistic, or they were maybe, encouraged to be a bit too optimistic in some directions. So I think being honest and being open-eyed, being collaborative, I think that's all important. We have seen examples, I think, where certain technologies have been quite successful. It's always underpinned by competent people who work together, in my opinion.
You are probably not for the first time being accused of being diplomatic, Laurie, right now in the chat. So I'm sure you've heard that. All right, thanks for that. I have two more questions for you. So to start
Gavin Mudd, of course, it's Gavin Mudd. Yeah, no, Gavin's correct. I'm being somewhat diplomatic. Yeah, I could be a bit harsher.
Awesome. So, I mean, okay, the reality is every site is different geology, climate, water balance, tailings, chemistry, etc. But how do you reconcile that with the fact that we need solutions that scale across industry? So, is there pattern matching from one site to another that works, or is it just gonna fall apart?
So Heather, I want to sort of talk to a concept we've done in the GWI, which is around certain archetypes in mining. So we focus particularly on flow sheet archetypes, and this theme around linking the geology of an ore deposit with the flow sheet archetypes that are currently sort of known and work, and potential future directions. So, for example, when Sarah was giving her talk about some of the mineralogy in copper deposits, we have certain sulfide minerals that are in the what we call the hypogene sections of the deposit, those that have not been weathered. Things like chalcopyrite, for example, the main copper bearing mineral, copper iron sulfide. And so the main technology we use there is flotation, as opposed to the surface layers which have been weathered, where there are various oxide minerals that are leached. So understanding how the geology of a deposit links to the potential flow sheet choices, and then linking that also with geography. So geographical factors, things like the proximity of the mine site to water sources, the topography which might affect where you can put certain wastes like tailings and waste rock, proximity to infrastructure communities, those type of things. So there certainly are patterns. I think when we come to the archetypes concept, we picked 4 commodities, so copper, gold, iron ore, and nickel. We've kind of done a matrix of the different types of flow sheet options, and then what are the big drivers? And then how can we potentially think about technology choices or flow sheet configurations and so forth to both make money and be economically viable, as well as understanding the waste and water related issues that come. So we know that geology, for example, ultimately affects the characteristics of wastes and what are the water pollution related challenges, what are the quantities and so forth. So certainly I think there are patterns, but on the other hand, every ore deposit is unique. And so there is some devil in the detail, if you like. And we still need to do the homework in terms of would certain solutions work in a particular context and so forth. And a good example of that is acid rock drainage risks in wet climates. So for certain copper deposits, certain gold deposits, etc., we have pyrite that ends up in the tailings and waste rock. And in a wet climate, for example, that's a huge risk in terms of polluting water. So I think we're trying to explore that area as SEEK, and we put that out there to a few parties, and I think they like the concept because we don't want to sort of be too, how do I say it? If you look at everything as being unique, then it's a lot of work, right? We do want to discover the patterns.
Absolutely. I think that would be really helpful. Just creating those common knowledge, common language across industry really helps.
Absolutely, yeah. Yep.
I have one last question, and then Sarah, when Laurie wraps up, we can hand it back to you because I'm worried about time as we go here. I can talk to Laurie all day. I just find I always learn so much. So my last question was really, Laurie, you've told me, we've talked before about how the industry is really fragmented. You were just speaking to it a bit.
Yes. Yep.
We need to pool effort on priority problems. Especially in areas like water, like tailings, energy, any of these sort of areas, we should all be working together. It shouldn't be a competitive advantage. So do you have any insight in what that actually looks like in practice and where you've seen it work?
Yeah, look, I think a couple of examples. Recently, BHP and Rio Tinto, 2 of the largest mining companies in the world, have worked together on a document around filtered tailings. So it's called Filtered Stack Tailings Guide for Study Managers. I'll pop the link into the chat for Eileen later on to circulate. But that's an example where mining companies who are competitors have come together, pooled resources. They've worked with leading industry consultants and with Colorado State University, put together this document, which I think is very good. It's open source. Provides really good information to make sound decisions around that particular technology choice, which would significantly reduce water consumption in a lot of mining types of projects. And another example is Professor Leslie Warren, who we met recently in Toronto and we saw last week at the Global Water Summit. She's a really, really good collaborator, and she's been doing work around biological type of systems and the role of bacteria in interactions with mine waste. And she's pulled together an industry consortium and has really accelerated and got people working together to understand that particular topic area. So great collaborators, I think, are key, and companies that are willing to be open and share information, because these problems are bigger than they can solve themselves.
Perfect. Thank you. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, both of you, for such a fabulous discussion. I think it was really interesting to really hear your insights into water. So both Laurie, from your perspective, but also the way you're asking the questions, Heather, because I think it's so important for us to understand, water doesn't belong to one company or something like that. And so how do we make best use of it as its entirety? So a massive round of applause to both of you. Thank you so much for coming along today, and awesome for all of the links that are in the chat. We're going to take a proper look at them. Thank you very much. Round of applause. Brilliant. Okay, our next presenter is the fantastic, the one and only Kevin. And so we've heard about water, but now we're going to hear more about artisanal and small-scale mining, and especially what happens when you get different types of organizations trying to operate in the same space. Now, Kevin, I know that you've got some slides that you want to share. If you want to start sharing them now on your massive monitor that we know you have your end.
Thank you. And I'll probably go off camera till afterwards, but let me just make sure I can make this work first.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Now, Kevin and myself, we've come across one another for many years, but we had a really good conversation at the PDAC conference in Toronto earlier on in the year, and it turns out we both went to the same university. Oh yes, the Royal School of Mines. So just while Kevin is getting ready with his presentation, in case you're interested, the Royal School of Mines, which is part of Imperial College London, turns 175 this year. Now, don't worry, neither Kevin nor I were there at the beginning of the Royal School of Mines, otherwise that would be remarkable. But if anybody is interested, there's a whole series of events that are being run, and you're more than welcome to sign up or come along and see what's going on there. So with that, please put your hands together for the fantastic Kevin D'Souza. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I presume you can see the slides.
Yep, we can.
That's great. So I'll go in. Regrettably, as we know, we've got to be quick on this, and my presentation's far less intellectual than the ones that have preceded, but I'll do my best here. And I'm going to talk about the issues related to the interface with artisanal and small-scale mining, ASM, and large-scale mining, LSM, or whatever acronym you want to give it. The fact is, we're talking about uncertainty. The fact is that increasingly, artisanal mining isn't just a problem on the edge of large-scale mining operations. It's part of the operating environment itself. Look, I've spent the last 3 decades at this interface in over 50 countries, and I've worked in some of the most conflict-ridden mine operations in the world. I'm the one who got the call at sort of 2 a.m. when hundreds of armed miners have invaded the pit. And the one thing I can tell you with confidence is this: so much of what we think we know about the artisanal mining sector and what we try and recommend doesn't survive that first contact with some of the mine sites around the world. And look, for this audience, when we're talking about responsible sourcing, that matters beyond the mine gate, because what happens at that interface is already in your supply chain, whether you know it or not. So there we go, that's worked. So look, ASM, artisanal small-scale mining, I said I'll use that acronym, is often framed as a development or formalization challenge, something that has to be, be fixed upstream before it becomes your problem. But increasingly, ASM intersects directly with industrial mining operations. Oops, sorry, it went back there. I apologize. The fact is, as I said, from my own experience, they create the interaction between artisanal and small-scale mining creates even more complex operational, social, environment, government, security problems that don't stay contained at the site level. As I said, over the last few decades, I've been involved in a lot of the responsible sourcing initiatives, from the Kimberley process to the Diamond Development Initiative, Conflict Gold, etc. And I've seen the evolution in this space from the inside. And the one thing that has remained consistent throughout for the millions of artisanal mining participants is at this interface is that responsible sourcing question is really a survival question. And I want to talk more about that survival question in more detail. Have a look at this map. Galamsey in Ghana, Gamperos in Lusophone Africa, Zamazama, South Africa, Orpailleurs in Francophone Africa, Ninjas in Mongolia. I could go on. These are not exotic footnotes. They represent over 20 million artisanal miners just in the gold sector. I should make that clear, just in the gold sector, operating in more than 80 countries, producing something like 20% of the world's gold, 85% informal, and I'll use that word lightly. And when you look at this map, you're not looking at a problem outside your gold supply. You're looking at what's inside it. And there's more and more reports coming out now, particularly in parts of Latin America and the Sahel, where criminal groups, where organized crime groups, where a whole lot of different actors are coming in. And now they're saying the gold sector, the illegal gold sector, is worth something like $31 billion a year. The ASM sector as well suffers, I have to say, from research fatigue, with the analysis leading to the same recommendations we've been talking about since the 90s, with just new buzzwords and sort of more academic typologies. We have no shortage of diagnosis. We know that ASM is embedded in local economies as a core livelihood strategy. Participation, we know, ranges from subsistence to income maximization. And in many contexts, it's economically rational, offering liquidity and immediacy to a lot of our actors, and accessibility that formal systems don't provide. Artisanal miners, in my experience, are making a calculation that isn't irrational. They are being very logical. For instance, large-scale mining concessions, exploration concessions, when we move around, we start to confirm geology, we start to build roads. We're sending economic signals that travel faster, much faster than any sort of management plan. And once established, ASM really disappears. Some common assumptions, and again, I'll go through these quite quickly. Most responses that we still have today are built on such assumptions, and that's why they fail in practice. And those assumptions are now embedded in a lot of global ESG frameworks and alleged sort of best practice strategies, repeating the same rhetoric for the last decades, as I mentioned earlier. Enforcement displaces activity rather than resolves it, and can strengthen criminal actors in many areas. And I've seen this firsthand, I said, from Colombia to Ghana to Tanzania and even Papua New Guinea. Formalization, or what now some folks are calling professionalization, fails to align the incentives of those that it's meant to formalize. We talk about alternative livelihoods, but they can't compete with the immediate cash-based income ASM actors can get. And the so-called best practice doesn't necessarily transfer across context or continents. And engagement, which is sometimes treated as endorsement of illegality, is often the only tool that reduces harm to both sides. It's risk management, it's not just endorsement. And these assumptions are not only wrong in principle, they fail consistently under real operating conditions. If we look at the structural drivers, at the core, income differentials are not marginal, they are decisive. They reinforced by informal supply chains that are unregulated and more often efficient, more trusted and more responsive to miners' needs. I'm saying the informal sector actually helps them better than anything the formal sector has built. And this should give us a bit of a pause. The question we should be asking isn't why people use the informal systems, it's why they avoid the formal systems that the global north tries to ask them to join. If the underlying incentives remain unchanged, and that is happening till this day, behavior will not change regardless of the intervention, intent, or design. And that is the central sort of challenge for sourcing frameworks that continue to rely on formalization as the primary lever to sort of help artisanal miners. I call this the proximity principle. This is a photo I've taken of a mass organized incursion on a gold mining site after a high-grade gold blast. This was highly organized. The closer ASM activity is to large-scale mining operations, the less useful standard response frameworks become. Proximity collapses the distinction between our problem and their problem. For the mining company, this interface is multi-layered risk management challenge, from security to human rights to health and safety. And for the miners, in this photo, for example, the boundary is drawn around their livelihood. Coexistent looks very different depending on which side of the fence or which side of the equipment you're standing on. And for responsible sourcing professionals like you all, the closer that interface is to supply to an entry point, the more directly these dynamics affect your due diligence obligations. And so many due diligences don't look at this. I should add, in small defensive mining companies, they face what I would call a double bind. They are asked to manage coexistence within systems they do not control, under regulatory pressures they did not design, and for systemic constraints they cannot resolve alone. And for a lot of mining companies I work with, acting carries risks, inaction carries blame. Structural tensions. So I'll just talk about this again quite quickly. Legal concessions rights versus local perceptions of legitimacy, generation or customary. A valid concession doesn't automatically translate into local acceptance. Lawyers always walk around legally grandstanding, and it doesn't always help. Legal rights are clear on paper. Legitimacy, I'm afraid, is still negotiated in practice, whether you're in Canada, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in New Guinea or anywhere else. Security enforcement versus human rights risk exposure. As I mentioned earlier, act and you risk escalation, don't act and you risk loss of control. Both pathways carry material consequences to companies, and I've worked with many companies that have faced those consequences, including sourcing your due diligence obligations. There were other trade-offs here, as I've mentioned: operational continuity versus social and political pressure, company responsibility versus limited state capacity, control within the mine fence versus limited influence beyond, and short-term responses versus long-term coexistence reality. Decisions, I'm afraid, being made under pressure today can shape dynamics for years, and tensions tend to formalize if you're not careful. And against the absence of sort of accessible legal pathways for formalization in many countries, from the ASM side, it's a challenge. And if you look at it from that ASM side, the tension is equal. Engage with the company and risk being sort of co-opted or, worse, criminalized. Don't engage and lose the influence over decisions that directly affect your livelihood, your income, what you're doing. And in practice, most mining companies are always managing trade-offs, not solving problems, as I mentioned in my first slide. And the sooner we hope sort of ESG frameworks and sourcing frameworks, responsible frameworks, etc., acknowledge that, I think the more realistic expectations of what, not corporate offices, but what site management can deliver on site. This map is certainly not academic. Look, I've worked on many of these sites personally, from North Mara to Porgera, Boissy, Rosebel, Gatsup. Different countries, different cultures, different decades. And the same structural pattern on every slide. High-grade material near the surface, a legacy of artisanal mining presence that predates sometimes the concession, or has followed the concession, the sort of exploration, weak state enforcement, and an economic signal that travels faster than any management plan. These hotspots are concentrating more as we see commodity prices rise, as we see more local unemployment, as we see climate change, as we see migration. And for this audience, again, the point is this: these are not edge cases. They represent the upstream sort of conditions that responsible sourcing systems are specifically designed to address, and where those systems most frequently struggle to deliver. In an increasing number of jurisdictions, and this is the worry, ASM-LSM interaction is not an anomaly. It is really part of the operating environment. Just to sort of finish as we head off, I know we want time for questions. You know, why do these interventions struggle, I mentioned? I've reviewed sort of more ASM type frameworks or best practice than I can count. And we could definitely spend all afternoon talking about them. They tend to be well researched, well designed, and generally thoughtful, I would say. Strong on diagnostics, but limited on execution. Pilots that don't scale, contexts that don't resist replication across jurisdictions or even in the same country. And the sector has really no shortage of what I would call well-intentioned ideas. It has far fewer examples of consistent, scalable, implementable sort of work that you can do on the ground. And this is the real problem that we had: credible implementation where the supply chain can actually look at lives and change the sort of uncertainty I've talked about. Okay, lastly, how do we really get past this? Coexistence is unavoidable. There was a time where companies would live and let live, try a bit of hybridization. But as we go forward, as all the things we're talking about, whether we're talking about critical minerals, commodity prices, coexistence between the large and small scale mining sector has to get better. Security responses, you know, really deliver sustainable outcomes, and structured frameworks improve consistency and understanding, but don't eliminate all those trade-offs I talked about that mining companies, operational mining companies struggle with. And genuine government alignment is essential. Again, if government's absence and doesn't do its stuff and just pushes companies, it's really hard for mining companies to operate in a vacuum. So interventions also must be realistic of economic sort of incentives, not just a desired outcome by donors or by ESG frameworks that are sort of written by the downstream actors. It's got to be reality on mine sites today. The objectives of ICETI is not elimination. Artisanal mining is part and will continue to be part of the mining ecosystem. It is a managed interface that has to respect livelihoods. And one measure that we always forget, it seems to disappear from a lot of sourcing frameworks, is whether the lives of artisanal miners and communities got better. Every single responsible mining framework doesn't actually talk about that. It talks about help for up to downstream folks, but not the miners. So I think when we start to talk about the welfare of miners and their communities and that sort of tension, we're much better off. So that's it. Sorry it was rushed. You know, last week I gave a whole morning to a lot of a whole room full of security professionals, and yesterday the government of Canada hosted about 50 small-scale artisanal mining folks here in Canada, and we were talking at great length and detail. So 10 minutes has been a bit of a rush, but I hope I've managed to give you a little taste of the sort of challenges of ASM where it exists, the formal, the informal side of it, and how sourcing can connect them, and sort of how we can engage to reflect both the operational reality, which we'll forget, and sort of human dignity. That's it. Thanks. Sorry it was quick.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And yeah, I mean, if you're up for doing an entire morning or a day of it, we will quite happily dial in and join you there. It is such a complex situation, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
In terms of, and as you said, there has been so much research done on this, but actually what we need is some sort of action, etc. But often, do people underestimate how complex it is? I mean, I know some of the conversations we've had earlier on today with, say, Melody, for example, begins to touch on this area as well. Kevin, if you could wave a magic wand and make something happen, what would it be? Would it be we're just going to coexist and so we actually optimize it for one another, or what is it?
I think the magic one that I would realize is look, how can I put this diplomatically? I also, now that I'm semi-retired, I'm on the board of a big Canadian NGO here. And one of the things NGOs and the development sector is learning, and I'm new to it, is we seem to import solutions from afar. And I'll use words, it's called neocolonial, it's called racist, you can call it what it wants, but we're coming up with solutions that are designed in the global north for the global south. Same with artisanal mining. So I think we've got to reverse that. We've got to look at how the development agencies have failed and where they're now learning, and we've got to replicate that. We cannot come up with solutions on our own. And secondly, we've got to listen to the mind, the folks on site. We spend a lot of time with the corporate offices or boards of directors, but the mine site, the GM it's the buck stops with them, and they are the ones facing the challenges. As I mentioned when I opened, at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're the ones that deal with it, not the legal counsel or the sort of the VP in the head office. So those two things, Sarah.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Thank you. There's a question from Gavin, and it's a question that Gavin always ponders based on his work in Australia, Papua New Guinea, and elsewhere. So how much of this problem, in inverted commas, should be government-led versus company-solved?
Good question, Gavin. As I mentioned, one of the big things I talked about yesterday with all these Tanzanian miners was what's government doing? Governments around the world, let's start with Ghana, in the 80s had good legislation, and most countries, have got reasonable legislation, policy, thou shalt do A, B, and C, and D, but they lack the resources to implement. So to answer your question, Gavin, government have to put in the framework, not just a policy or talk about things in the capital, but down in the mining areas so that mining companies can operate. Mining companies cannot be the government. They cannot substitute for that. They can be an actor, but they cannot sort of regulate, enforce, and do what the government should do. So you do need both. And the absence of the government in sort of these countries, in the actual areas around mine sites, is a worry. And then, I don't know if you saw in one of my slides, I mentioned some of the operations. If you look at Peru, Nigeria, a whole lot of them, Sahel, just now they've talked about something like 3,000 soldiers in the DRC. The US is going to fund for so many million. the enforcement side is getting too much. We're spending more on enforcement than actually coexistence.
Yeah, and I've seen that firsthand in the DRC as well, and it's truly terrifying.
Yeah.
On that delightful note, sorry about that, Kevin. I'm going to say a massive thank you once again. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much.
Sorry, it was rough.
No. And there are some more questions for you in the chat as well. So our next speaker that we're going to welcome to the stage is the fantastic Tesni. Now, Tesni, I know that you have got a number of aspects you'd like to talk about, especially with regards to all bark, no bite, with regards to jobs and careers within the sector. So with that, please put your hands together for the fantastic Tesni Morgan. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks very much. Yeah, this is going to be a slightly different conversation to what's previously had on the excellent talks that we've had so far. And this is by far not going to be a technical talk. This is very much going to be just experiential from myself. So as a little background for myself, I'm working now at early career in exploration geology. I graduated from St Andrews in 2024, and have now been in the industry for coming into my second year. And so for me, when I got into this industry, when I first started interacting with the industry, really was probably in my final year of university, and it started with taking on the WIM student chapter role and exploring that. And really, I was just being a bit cheeky because I was thinking, what jobs do I want to have after this? How am I going to get there? And I thought I hadn't had any, there weren't that many networking events at the university. So I thought, right, I'll see if I can run a couple. I'll benefit from it. My peers will benefit from it. Hey, presto, we'll see if we can get a job out of it. And then also starting to attend conferences. And there are many really good conferences that offer student free passes. And I definitely advocate for students to be able to attend those if they can. And it was at the industry conferences, most of all, that I found that we quite often really enjoy having the conversation on next generation talent. What is that pipeline? We all sit and agree that we need to be seeing more talent coming into the industry. We're going to have skills gaps. We need to be filling that workforce. The conversation surrounds critical metals, what that looks like for the country, what that looks like for the globe. And it's very much a hot topic that rightfully has its space in these conferences. So I first heard that discussion in my final year, in that 5th year, and then went to the conference the next year and we had the same conversation. It's like great to see that spirit is still there. Went to another conference and had the same conversation. And what really stood out to me and what started to frustrate me a little bit is that as these years went by, I went from being the student listening to them to then being the early career with my graduate peers looking for these jobs, to then being also with my outreach hat on, working with students, seeing students have the same impression of me, oh great, there's a space for me in this industry. And then also going through that route of, okay, well now I'm looking for those opportunities. And so what's really struck me is that actually of the colleagues of my peers in my cohort, and similar to peers that I've met at these conferences, is that actually we're very keen to have these conversations. We're very keen to all nod our heads and agree and say this is very much a space that we need to explore, that we need to support. And yet there are quite a few of my peers who are actually unable to access this. They are being turned away at the door of the industry because those jobs are actually not there for them here in the UK. And so this is meant to be a discussion. This is an open floor for everyone to sort of start bringing in. And if you disagree with me, if you agree with me, please by all means, like give your opinions. And yeah, so I wanted to explore this idea that when we're having these discussions, it is fantastic that we're having them. It's fantastic that it is such an important topic in so many levels of the industry. But we need to be thinking, okay, how are we actually making this how are we actually going to get this talent pipeline? Why is it that we're having this discussion and yet the attendees who are now looking at it, who are now watching this, who are participating in this discussion, are actually struggling to then find those roles here in the UK? And it is UK focused because obviously I'm a bit more experienced in that. And so yeah, so really just trying to think who's responsible for this and who is it that should be like who needs to be the biggest voices in these rooms, in these conversations.
So Tesni, I guess with this, a couple of questions for you. So one of the high level or kind of most widely cited risks on any company risk register is the attraction and retention of talent, as in kind of making sure we've got the right people in those companies, etc., able to do the jobs. When you're in those conferences and people are going, yes, come and join the sector, are they, what kind of jobs are they almost advertising, as it were, in the UK? What are they saying to you?
Well, I think the bit of a disparity in the messaging is that a lot of the attendees at these conferences and a lot of where the outreach focus is on is, and I'm going to be sad to say this, but is geology focused, and I think the messaging that comes from that is more primary production focused. But I think the reality of what we excel in and what the strengths are in the UK is something further along the lines than that. We're looking at maybe where our strengths are lying are more in the downstream processing, and more in the battery metals, and more in the refinery, and more in the services as well. You know, the UK is a mining hub in the financial sector. How is that translating into the students that we are reaching with our outreach, who are actively engaged in that conversation already at university, and then who are able to go to these events, have these conversations, and leave the event with a clear plan, this is where I'm going to go. So I think, you know, with my little outreach hat on as well, I do sometimes wonder, is it a lack of imagination, or is it no coincidence that actually a lot of the student chapters who first engage with the resourcing industry are geologists? Because a lot of the time in our courses, those are often where that conversation is first had, or at least it's one that just hammered home a bit more, more quickly. But actually, I think when it comes to universities, do we need to be making sure that we're reaching into other departments, into other sections, on the opportunities that are available and the ones that will have roles to go into here in the UK? I think there's room to improve on some of that discussion, on that communication.
So just to bounce back on that, and then maybe I'll bring in Jeff Townsend, who's joined us on the call, which is great because Jeff is one of the co-founders of the Critical Minerals Association in the UK. And I know, Jeff, you have recently put together a big piece of work that looks at skills, etc. in the UK. It's almost like we planned this and made it happen. So Tesni, just being a bit provocative with you, are you saying that natural resource companies are almost being lazy by engaging with the earth sciences departments rather than a more integrated approach across the kind of different departments in a university to try and connect with the right students who might be able to go into those sectors?
I think almost, yes. Almost. So in the sense that I think that the traditional routes that we take having this discussion is very much in the earth science department. And we know that there are changes in the students in earth science departments. We know that that's not necessarily where students are choosing to take their careers forward. And so this is very much, trying to be positive about it. It's very much an opportunity that we, as the industry, need to be focusing on non-traditional sources of that talent for the needs that we actually have. And this conference is a great example of just how interdisciplinary the resource sector is. And we really need to be ensuring that is reflected in some of that outreach just between students going through graduation and into those first roles.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tesni. Jeff, I don't know if you want to come into this discussion, if you've got any thoughts.
Well, thank you for saying that, Tesni. I couldn't agree with you more. So it's something that we've raised, and you mentioned something earlier, which is there's a lot of talk, but of course, words only have power if they're followed by action. or supported by action. And I think one of the issues that we've had in the UK is that we recognize there is a desperate requirement to get good, skilled people into the industry. But that perhaps we're trying to fill that now so we don't face a talent vacuum in 4 or 5 years when these things fully come online. With that being said, that link has always been weak and needs to be stronger. Now, we have at the CMA been very lucky in that we've been working on a talent pipeline. So in collaboration with Innovate UK, with Department of Business and Trade, looking at where all the gaps are within the UK critical mineral sector in terms of talent, what is required, so what jobs are required, what gaps there are, and how do we do that? And what I would love to do is put you in touch with Becca, who ran that program for us. I mean, the good thing about the CMA is I'm by far the dumbest person in it. So we'll put you in touch with Becca, who is incredibly brilliant, and we will get your thoughts fed in. That launches on the 18th in Parliament. So I'll also see if we can try and get you along to that as well.
Brilliant, thanks.
There's also as well, Tesni, I think Miranda's about to post it into the chat. Back in 2023, the IOM3 wrote a paper on skills within critical minerals. And what was really excellent about that, I know that Ben Lepley, who's on the line, I think Ben has something to do with the SRK part of that back in a previous life when he used to work there. But it was really interesting because it wasn't just, hey, you can be an exploration geologist. It was, here's the diversity of different roles that are out there as well. Because I think it's a case of, I mean, I always think that I'm about 25. Apparently, I'm not anymore, which is a surprise to me and to the
everyone else as well. Everyone else.
But I think it was a case certainly when I was graduating, it was certainly a case of if you wanted to go into mining, you had to go abroad. Because there wasn't really anything here. And I don't know, Kevin, if you want to come in on this, because obviously you studied in London, but you didn't stick around in London, did you?
No, good. I think that was such heartfelt, Tesni. Thanks so much. Yeah, look, I graduated today. The reason why I didn't stick around in London was, first of all, mining. When I was there, we still had mining. We still had, Royal Schools of Mines was there. There was Leeds. There was Cardiff. Now it's just Camborne. And we still did mining. It was still a small department in the Royal School of Mines, but it was still mining. But most of the people that graduated with me would go to South Africa. I got interviewed, but for obvious reasons, I could never go to South Africa. They wouldn't even give me a job. So yes, I did leave to go to other countries. But when I came back, there still wasn't much mining. And to Jeff's point, from the UK point of view, they've known this talent shortage for decades. Now it's critical because we've got critical minerals in. But it's too little too late, the UK is doing. This should have been done a decade ago. And it's not saying it all is lost. At least I've seen in Canada and other places, they've been really focusing on, to your point, Tesni, not just geologists, but engineers, accountants, sustainability professionals, everybody there. Here, people know, if you even see on TV, the adverts to join mining are so varied. It's not just the geologists. In fact, they're kind of like the ones people don't talk about. It's everything else they talk about. Mechanics, both trades and university, they focus on. So vocational trades. So look, it's not helping in the UK. Hopefully things will change through what Jeff mentioned. But I think the universities, the IOM, I forget what it's called now, IOMMM, and these groups really have to reach out much more. They did used to do it, as you know, Sarah, but they seem to have lost it again. And now they're all running around like headless chickens trying to help. But we need much more. And maybe some folks could learn what's happening here in Canada, Australia, and in places like Ghana and Tanzania with the schools. People are, every country's doing this.
I think as well, also, it's a case of quite often, if you're doing a geology degree, you think, right, exploration geology, let's face it, that's where the exciting rocks are, right? And that's where the excitement is. But actually, as Kevin's just mentioned, a lot of the jobs within the sector aren't that. And that's where actually getting a job in, say, construction or something like that, I'm just going to bring in Burek on this, but where we have a lot more of it in the UK. kind of getting that initial experience in an equivalent or a much better sector, and then being able to pull that back into mining. I mean, what you find is some of the most exciting construction projects in the UK have got something to do with mining aspects. I don't know, Burak, if you want to comment on that.
Yes, it's almost just listening to the mining sector. It's absolutely exact. I mean, it's very, very parallel to the challenges Kevin mentioned in the construction sector in terms of trades and skills. But I was wondering if we do have a bigger problem than just construction or mining in terms of generational gap, in terms of expectations, in terms of the gap between the requirements of the current jobs and maybe the future of jobs. I do think that our sectors, heavy industries, have increasingly become less and less attractive. And as they have become increasingly less and less attractive, one thing that I've also learned in construction, we do have big contractors and we have these graduate schemes. We have, people go through trade schools, all these skills hubs. One of the biggest challenges is retention, is that a lot of young people who enter the construction industry don't stay. And I think as an industry, Jeff, you were wondering about overall, critical minerals and skills. One thing is to attract people from the graduate stage, but it's another thing to retain them in a sector that continuously will need their skills. And the other thing that's happening in construction, which I am sure will happen increasingly in mining, is a lot of people with aging population are retiring. That means we have a major gap when it comes down to, I have very good friends of mine. They asked me the other day, because I also do some teaching about AI and construction, and they asked me, and their kids are very good in STEM. They were like, should they, they're really bright students, should they go and do that, or should they become plumbers? So I do genuinely think that, in terms of job security, I do genuinely think that our heavy industries have a much bigger problem than just companies not doing enough or not connecting. We got to go to the source of the problem. And I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody does.
So one final thing there as well, or two final things there, Tesni, is that so I was at a conference a couple of years ago in the US, so one of their big exploration and mining associations. And one thing that they asked the room was how many people in that room had set out life or had come out of university with an intention to go into mining. And almost nobody.
Yeah.
So, so this is also a case of a lot of people finding their way into the sector kind of through other routes as well. So I think that's really interesting as well through other parts of the world. But the skills requirements, they are changing. And so in terms of exploration and mining companies needing people who can use AI, for example, people who can, even have an inkling of what Melody and Kevin were saying in terms of understanding the social context and some of those complexities, because those are not things that we get taught at university and stuff like that. I think that's important. So only go.
No, I was going to say, I think that really comes back to the point of when we're talking about mining, when we're having this discussion, we need to go past the traditional routes. We need to be having these discussions outside of an earth science deposit model or conversation. And so when we're as students coming in, also having that interdisciplinary chat, having that using I'm always an advocate for student chapters, always will be, but using those chapters to be able to go past the department walls, to go past those classroom walls, and bring other sectors into a conversation, I think is going to be key to setting the ball rolling there on making sure we have other perspectives coming into the industry first of all. And also I always back up as well that it's not just about students being undergraduates or master's students who are about to leave university. We also need to consider PhDs and that extra level of technical expertise that they have and how they're going to get incorporated into this talent pipeline. And also looking at early career, that once graduates finish university, oftentimes with a lot of these opportunities, such as the free student passes, such as going to some of these events, participating in some of these talks, oftentimes that graduation is that end to that. And we need to be making sure that we keep a door open there for early careers for the first, second, third years, because we're not seeing students who are graduating and immediately going into their job as well. We're looking at students who are 1 year, 2 year, 3 years out of graduation who are still looking at applying to these the graduate roles. Because there is that competition that I'm seeing in my cohort. This is my sort of lived experience now, is that there is that competition and there is that disparity in that conversation.
Tesni, Melody's put a really interesting question in the chat. Melody, I don't know if you want to come off mute and pose it.
Sure. I mean, the question really is from my experience over the past several years as younger people have been coming into my industry. An old way that I used to screen resumes would be to look at how long you were in jobs. And, lately I've been seeing a lot of resumes that, people are in a job for 6 months, a year. And it seems like the expectation of a bit of longevity might not be the same for more recent graduates than it was, say, for me and probably for Sarah and others. And so I'm wondering, and I think that has an impact on what Barak was mentioning about, this retiring issue where you get these senior leaders with extremely deep experience, deep knowledge in a sector, and how do you replace them really? And I'm wondering how you're thinking about your own career and how your friends and colleagues are thinking about it.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a topic that comes up quite a lot in discussion with early careers, is that that sense of, do you stay with one company long enough or do you keep bouncing? And I think there's a bit of is the word empowerment in people as individual workers. I think there can be a view of yourself as the individual worker who's able to move between these companies, and sometimes that culture doesn't feel like you're working to improve one specific company's repertoire or stay with one specific company for your whole career development. And I think people are aware that they want to develop their careers, they want to develop their skill set. And so there can be a bit of expectation that you will be jumping from group to group as there's a perception that there's going to be that instability in staying with one company for long enough. And I think there maybe is a cultural shift there, that we're not looking at staying with one group, or maybe that we feel that cultures in companies aren't wrapped around keeping that retention, aren't wrapped around that development, and that from early career right on. It's definitely something that people are playing around with.
I think it's absolutely fascinating, isn't it? I think every single one of us is sitting here going, oh, well, hang on a second. What did I do? What did I think? What did I feel? What did I experience? What were my assumptions? Where was I wrong? Where was I right? But of course, the world isn't the same as what it was when Melody and myself were 24. The world has moved on. And Sarah, as somebody who's doing your PhD at the moment, what does the world look like to you from a career perspective?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I feel like PhDs are kind of a unique time because there is that sort of temporal investment that everyone is choosing to make. You're choosing to spend 5 years becoming an expert in whatever field that you choose. So maybe after the fact, there's a bit more desire for that kind of sort of stability and maybe longevity in a career, that kind of Melody was alluding to. I do feel like with this generation, maybe there's a bit more of that movement between companies, especially being in the Bay Area here. A lot of my friends work in tech, and I think there's that sort of constant movement every few years as the way to kind of, for a lot of people, increase their salaries. But I think it's sort of dependent on what sorts of fields that you might be interested in. And I do think for a lot of PhD graduates from the earth sciences, I know quite a few people who work at various mining companies now, and there maybe is a bit more desire for stability. And yes,
Brilliant.
Melody, at least 5 years. 5 years is the lower end of that for sure, at least in the US.
In the US, yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, we cheat and we do it in less time over on this side of the Atlantic, which obviously degrades our PhDs compared to yours, Sarah. But Jeff, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, and I get everyone's coming from. Perhaps a counterpoint would be that if you're willing to stay with an organization, there's an opportunity through showing that loyalty to learn. I don't know what the technical term is, but some skills and contacts and ways of doing things that perhaps aren't just the norm. And therefore you do benefit from loyalty to a company if you are willing to stay for a bit. And I think that is something that's perhaps overlooked by the younger generation. Certainly the CMA is, very young. I'm the old granddad, kicking about. But I do think there is a need to understand that there are some ways of working that you won't perhaps learn if you're just there for 6 months. If you're willing to put your time in, if you're willing to build some trust, then the senior leadership are willing to trust you, and therefore they'll teach you some of the tricks of the trade that perhaps they wouldn't if they see that you're just passing through.
So it's an interesting thing, and I think the issue in a way is that every person's journey is unique.
Yeah.
And so much of it is actually about being in the right place at the right time, or you get this opportunity and your gut or your brain then goes, right, do I do it or not? And I think as well, so from a really personal perspective, so I started my own company and I chose to be based in the UK. So this is also a case, and of course it's difficult when you're at the beginning of your career, but when you get some of that experience under your belt, you don't need to wait for somebody else to give you a job. Actually, for many people, it's much more fun to go and create that job for yourself. And then you get into that world, just like Jeff, just like many other people on the call. And then you get to the point where suddenly you're employing people. And from a personal perspective, if I thought people would come and join my organization and then disappear in 6 months' time, you know what? Don't even bother asking me for a job. Or at least be really clear about what you want from the start. Because as a small company employer, it takes a huge amount of effort to bring somebody into that team, thinking about the culture and the dynamics of the team, etc. as well. So I think the money aspect is a small part of the equation compared to the broader, what's the culture and the vibe and that dynamic with regards to the broader organization. But every company is different, absolutely. Kevin has very patiently had his hand up for ages, and then we'll go to Jeff.
Having been working for some of the big mining companies over here in Canada, a word of caution, and I mentor a lot of folks. Loyalty is something that I was taught, and my generation was taught with a company. You stay for a company until you retire. The only loyalty I recommend young people to have is to themselves. Mm-hmm. Because you're expendable. I'm sorry, I'm just being honest. Everybody's expendable, even the CEO. Have loyalty to your own career. Define your own career. Decide where you want to go. And yes, use the companies as they're going to be using you to define that. You do have to stay in a company a bit. Don't change too often, because you'll lose out. Not just the company, but you will lose out. But decide what you want in your career path, as Sarah says. Do you want to be a technical expert? Do you want to be a manager? Do you want to manage people? Do you want to, it's very, very different. Some people are always going to be great at technical stuff, and they're going to be a director of tailings. That's it. Other people are going to be a senior vice president. They're going to be leadership. Define early where you think you're going to go. You can always change it. It's not casting command. And then start mapping out which companies are going to give you that experience. But don't fall for the loyal to a company and that you're going to get this big pat on the back one day. It doesn't happen, I'm afraid. And again, be careful what you wish for. The higher up you go in companies, sometimes you're doing less of what you enjoyed. Like a senior vice president geologist, my friends, they don't do what they used to do. They're pushing paper all day long and making PowerPoints. They don't do what they want. They're not licking rocks anymore. Same with me. So define that and look at it that way. But you got to get into the companies that give you the best experience on the ground. You can't shortcut lived experience. That's the truth. You just can't shortcut the lived experience.
I think that's very fair, Kevin. And I think that bringing back to that sort of empowerment that people feel, it's also on a company to make themselves feel like a culture that people will want to stay in. It's also for a company to be an attractive option for someone to stay in for several years. If you're able to see how you're being developed and how you're being supported, I think a lot of young people are very aware of the fact that professional development is key to you carrying on your career. People want to be able to see early on that they're able to go somewhere with a company. And I think that is, as Sarah sort of referred to as well, that if people are moving for salaries, it's like, okay, well, why is that? What is it that's different in that salary? Am I not comfortable asking this company for an increase, or is there no promotions that I can go for that would come with that? So am I moving for a different opportunity to progress? I think that's very, very, that's very key for a lot of young folks. And also, if I may ask as well, on the point that you brought in, Sarah, as well, do you, to everyone in the audience, do you feel that it's a barrier to employing young graduates, young early career, that you think that actually I'm not going to invest in you because there is a chance that you might be leaving in 6 months? Do people feel that that's a barrier as to why graduates are struggling to get into these early career roles?
No, I don't think so. I don't think you would, if you've got a role and you're looking, especially for an early career person, you're taking a chance on somebody who does have less experience compared to somebody else. But the reason why you're doing it is because you see the potential that is there. We almost don't care what you've been taught at university, to be honest, but we see your potential and your passion and your drive and your curiosity and your eagerness to learn. And so actually that's a case of, we really want you to stay for a longer period of time. And so I think this sector is very different to the tech sector. So as Sarah was mentioning, in the Bay Area, there's a reason why people are hopping around a lot. But we don't have that same vibe within mining.
That's cool.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think exploration is a bit weird because people do get, kind of fixed term employment jobs where you might go for a field season or something. But then when you look in the broader sector, you are looking for that longer term development that's coming through. Burak, you've got your hand up, and then Jeff, and then we'll do a bit of a wrap up.
Thank you. Fantastic conversation. I'm just going to lower my hand. One thing that I've recognized when people talk about job hopping, moving from place to place, I worked for a contractor developer, then I worked for an engineering company, and those were more closer to mining. I think there was a lot of older people, engineers, valued, experienced, almost need to do time to get to places, very different than tech sector, right? That was the view. Then I have also worked for a couple of consulting companies, which had a very different model, really bright young people, right? They just employed a lot of young, bright people. What I realized was that there was a huge disconnect in terms of the young people and their expectations and the leadership of those companies in terms of role modeling. And in many cases, I have seen really good examples of reverse mentoring, that I almost feel like the older generation needs to think harder about the expectations and the needs if we really want to inspire younger generation to stay in our sector. And we need to take ownership of it, because there's a lot of tendency, I feel, this is just self-reflection. A lot of people think, oh, well, they just change jobs every 6 months. They don't know what they want. They're always on their phones. There's this generational dismissal. But I do think that we also, older generation, don't look and recognize how different we are to them. And I think it's the first time someone said that 5 generations are right now in the workforce. There's big expectations difference between people. And I think that there's a lot of ownership. We should really do a lot more self-reflection.
And that right there, Burak, ties this all the way back into a lot of what we're hearing through the conference, which is no matter who you are, be it different generations looking to work in a sector, or different stakeholders or rights holders that are located in an area that might have the potential for some sort of natural resource extraction, or different governments, for example, attempting either to work together or not with regards to those mineral supply chains, etc. It's that question of respect and actually seeking that respect and the courage to get better at communicating. And I think more than that as well, the courage to actually say what it is you expect of a situation. Because otherwise, I think people default to what they would do with themselves in that situation. And I think, Tesni, you make a really, really good point of, what is it that you're looking for? Is it you're looking for more money because you want to do X, Y, Z? Or actually, is it a case where you just don't feel comfortable in an environment? Or what is it that you're actually seeking? We quite often make assumptions, I think, that somebody else knows what it is we're looking for. And the answer is we don't. And so by having that conversation, but also as well, creating a space where you can have that conversation.
For sure. And I think that goes both ways as well. I think for a lot of young people at the moment, they're also asking, okay, what is it that you're looking for? What is it the employer is looking for? What is it that I need to prepare for to go into this market? Because coming back to that original point, we've already got people at the table. We've already got people knocking at the door saying, I want in. I know what this industry is. I've gone to a few events, like, I want in. And we're not giving them the room to come into that industry. And coming back to sort of that main question here of how are we going to sort of resource this talent pool in the next few years, it's such a key topic for so many people. But we have people knocking at the door right now. Why can't we answer the door to them? Why are people waiting a year, 2 year post-graduation to enter this industry? And then they're turning away. And again, with people who are already starting in the careers in this industry, like, how can we maintain them here? How can we keep their attention? What is it that we as the industry can now provide that they need to support the students going into the young career going forward? And I think we definitely need to make sure that we're having space for that conversation in the general talent pool, next generation discussions,
Brilliant. I think with that, I'm going to give you a massive round of applause, Tesni, because thank you so much for bringing this into the conversation. And it's certainly something that we do need to talk about it more. We need to listen more. And I think as well, create those spaces. And to be honest as well, maybe some tough love. If there are certain areas where there aren't jobs or whatever, actually acknowledging that. So we're not wasting people's time. But then where there are jobs, getting much better at saying, right, well, this is what we're expecting, and here's the competition with other people from across the world. So absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much, Tesni.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for taking part as well.
So we're going to finish off with a very, very, very quick roundup from around the room. I'm just going to bring Jeff into the conversation. I know he's going to talk about talent, isn't he? But Jeff, any reflections from yourself from the conversations that we've had this afternoon, and then we'll go to Barak.
Just very quickly. I mean, I loved everything that was said. So one of the things I'm going to try and tie the two together, Kevin won't remember me, but I first met him when he was working for Katanga, I think, back in the day. And he stood out then as someone who was absolutely dedicated to trying to do the right thing. And it's, clearly still has that passion burning bright. And I think artisanal mining is one of the areas that needs to be solved. It absolutely does. And I loved everything you said. So, it's great to see that you're still fighting the fight, and that's wonderful. And that goes then to Tesni. One of the big things that I have done throughout my time when I've been able to employ people, often we get the same CVs, the same people coming through the door. It is intangibles that make the difference in talent. And if you can show that you have fire inside you can show that you have a purpose and a direction, that will get you further than the same CV as everyone else. So, don't let all the knockbacks that you will get take that out of you. Because if you can carry on fighting, then people will see that and they'll want that in their team. But I loved what I've heard, everything today, and it's just reaffirms why I get up in the morning to try and make a difference. And I'm always, this week always shows me that it's not just me out there doing it. I never thought it was, but there's so many people out there in the industry that just want to make the world a better place. So hats off to you guys.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Awesome. Burak, how about yourself? And then we will go to Tesni.
Thank you. I think, Jeff, I'm going to build on to what you said. There's lots of people who want to make the world a better place, and that's what I'm left with. Even though I'm not from this sector, it's really wonderful to hear all the different angles, whether it's about, artisanal mining, whether it's about, water use, whether it's about human rights. Just generally speaking, people care. I'm actually, the one thing I'm really disappointed about, though, is what I heard from you, Tesni, is that my perception of this sector was that it's a booming sector. It's a much critical sector, that I was expecting all these graduates, and it's a bit like nuclear is a capability we had lost in the UK, and now we're ramping that up, right? I just thought that we would be recruiting anybody and anyone who's available into roles and investing in them as a country. But I'm really disappointed to hear we're not doing that.
Thanks, Burak. Tesni, over to you, and then we'll go to Melody.
Yeah, for sure. Sort of building on that is that, it's great to see and have these conversations in conferences such as this, where we see how interdisciplinary, how many opportunities there are within it. And we really need to be making sure that when we're engaging with that early stage talent pool, that we are taking those different sectors, taking those different disciplines to make the most of the talent that is here, because people are interested, young people are keen to get in, and I think we do them a bit of a disservice sometimes with our views of them, the perception of what they are, when actually we have plenty of people knocking down the door that want to get into here. So we need to make sure that we're really making the most of that. And then going forward, still continuing with the outreach that so many groups are doing so well now, to keep that pool ticking.
Great, thanks, Tesni. Melody, and then we'll go to Kevin.
Thanks, Sarah. And it's been lovely having this opportunity to be with everybody today. I wanted to say that I think that even Burak's talk was very illuminating and speaks to part, and of course, Kevin speaks to part of what I think the transparency and communication space needs to be, because in general, I don't think that the knowledge base in anywhere is really, people aren't aware of what goes in to what they're using all day, every day. People don't know what gold is in. Gold is in everything. And so, that level of communications and transparency around and traceability, I think in, that sort of the human rights aspect that Burak was talking about, I just think it's so critical for us to increasingly be discussing this publicly, talking about it, because we are an interconnected world. And what happens in Ghana with Galamsey also impacts people, in the UK. So I just think it's really important that we have these conversations more and more frequently.
Brilliant. Thanks, Melody. And Kevin, over to you.
I'm not sure what to say. The fact is, society doesn't trust mining. We're not a liked industry globally. We can have our little echo chambers. We can use word critical to make ourselves feel good. The world doesn't like mining. It's not great. I remember my mother-in-law, when I was in the UK, hated I was in mining because she dealt with all the emphysema cases in the coal mines. So things haven't changed. We're still the bad guys. But changing that, looking at from this side of the ocean, I know what's happening in the UK, but in Canada and elsewhere, we are attracting the talent. We are trying to keep it there. And I'm not saying Tesni come into my grave, but hopefully the industry and industry bodies can reach out more to young groups. But it as I think somebody said, it works both ways. We've got to get the young ones also to explore and understand what mining does and what it doesn't do, where the careers are, not just at the beginning at the exploration geology, all the way through. The variety of people that a large mining company will employ is important. So we've got to do a better job, and I think we've got to work out how to get more. I'm going to stop there because of time. I could talk too much.
Absolutely. And I think final words with regards to that is that isn't it awesome that people actually want to come into the sector, Kevin? I mean,
it's here in the Canada they want to because they know what the bloody salaries are like. That's why.
but it ain't like that in the UK. That's the thing. So I think it's a case of it's brilliant. So thank you very much, Tesni, for putting this conundrum on the table, because I think it really does then come back into that world of certainty, uncertainty, etc. I mean, we know that within you know, 1 in 1,000 exploration projects turns into a mine. I mean, why the hell would you go into that as a sector? That is not something to bet on. And so that's one of the reasons why most exploration companies are very small, very lean. There's not a lot of money. And, you know, people will say that they've got a lot of money. They don't really. One of the main reasons why the likes of JORC, etc., haven't been updated as perhaps they should have been is because it would have downgraded a whole load of those reserves to not even resources. So people who are paper millionaires actually aren't, because there's no way that rock is coming out the ground. So there's all kinds of weirdness, especially in that world of exploration. And then you go into the world that Melody was talking about, where you really bring in the human aspects and it gets even more complicated. But this is why we love it. We love this sector, and we know that raw materials as a whole is fundamental. We know that we should be doing this in better ways. We spent the last week talking about things that we know about that we don't do. So perhaps we need to listen to ourselves and actually just get on and do some of that. So on the note of getting on with it, that was the 5th session of 6 for this year's Responsible Raw Materials, and a massive thank you to everybody who's watching there on YouTube, here in Zoom, engaging in the chat and everything. It's been absolutely fantastic. We've got our final session tomorrow starting at 8 a.m. UK time, and we've got a lineup of fantastic speakers. They include the phenomenal Frøydis Cameron Johansen, and so she has spent a long time working in Shell and then Anglo American, and then most recently in Rio Tinto as the being in charge of all of the health, safety, environment and security aspects for that company. We're then hopping across a bit more with regards to geophysics, etc. We're going to dive into the world of research and understanding the structural integrity of different aspects with Kara. And we've got Scott Yarham from Project Blue, who's going to be talking a little bit more about what's going on with pricing and commodities. Madhuri is going to come and speak to us about understanding stakeholder engagement, etc., with regards to what it's like on the ground from an operational perspective. Mikesh from the University of Cambridge is going to come and speak to us a bit about how do we integrate lots of data from around the world and through that really understand what is going on. And we've got our very own Aileen Doran, who's going to be talking about the perspective from EDIG, and so therefore bringing in that diversity. And then, of course, we've got Matt and Sean, who are going to try and stitch it all together by saying, well, we've got all of these different aspects of risk. How do we bring this all together so that whilst there might still be a huge amount of uncertainty, we can feel a bit more comfortable with regards to the direction of travel? So with that, everybody, fantastic to see you all. Thank you very, very much. And we will catch you all tomorrow. Thank you.